Enoch moved through the wilderness with a step that had learned the language of stones and wind. Each footfall seemed to answer a question no one remembered asking, and the hush that wrapped the desert was not emptiness but something waiting. Long before the revelation came, he felt a presence like a patient listening, and that patience had weight and expectation. The sky above him was a vast slow drum of color, blue losing itself at the horizon into the pale heat that trembled like a held breath. He walked as if he had been returning, though he did not yet know the road he had been away from. Enoch walked through silence that felt alive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what stirs you more, the peace in his steps or the mystery waiting beyond the horizon. The first signs came quietly, a sudden stillness in the air, a hush among the reeds by the seasonal spring that did not belong to wind. Animals that had been grazing lifted their heads and blinked with the slow intelligence of creatures who know when something older than hunger has passed by. Enoch paused and listened, and there it was, not a voice at first but the shape of a voice, an expectation of sound that made the air itself attentive. The moment lengthened, not like time stretching but like a string being tuned, each vibration aligning itself to an order he had only half remembered. He steadied his breathing to match that new cadence, and somehow the world bent with him. When the voice came, it did not explode into the night. It arrived as one arrives in stages, like a word stepped into by a traveler who takes his time. It was a voice without a visible mouth. It belonged to the distance and the closeness at once, neither male nor female in the way this world divides sound. The voice called his name, and because names carry the essence of what they name, his name responded like a bell. There was no thunder, no blazing column of fire, only presence and a directness that erased all ornament. In that directness, Enoch felt the private corridor of his life open up into a hall of sunlight. He had been taught by elders and by the geometry of seasons, by the habits of beasts and by the timbre of his own knees. They had shown him maps of behavior and ritual, taught him the hours when the world seemed to tilt toward mercy. Yet this was different. It was not a lesson taught by men, but a summons that felt older than instruction. The voice asked nothing complicated. It asked for attention and for a turning. It invited him into testimony, and the offer was simpler than a bargain. Come, witness. In answering, Enoch felt the ground shift suddenly, like a page turning in the book of his life. First revelations are not always spectacles. Sometimes they are small clearings in the bramble of everyday worries. The voice spoke in terms that brushed aside his fears with a softness that was not indulgent but fierce in its honesty. Walk with me, it said, and the wind at the fringe of the desert seemed to echo the invitation. That phrase carried a dimension of companionship and of mission. To walk with the voice was to be guided and to become a guide. Enoch's heart tightened and loosened at once, the paradox of an immediate obedience that felt like liberation. He walked farther into the wilderness, and with every step the terrain changed as if the land itself bent toward new revelation. Pebbles gave way to black shale, then to white limestone, each rock as if polished by the passing of ages. There was a drought-split tree that stood like a sentinel and a small pool where water was clear enough to reflect the sky as a bowl holds a flame. In the quiet intervals, he heard the voice giving shape to what his feet were already teaching him, that landscape can be parable, that a cracked stone can outline a moral point, that rivers remember paths that the mind forgets. The voice described the world in terms of covenant and law, but not as dry doctrine. It spoke of relationship and pattern. As the sun lowered, casting long fingers across the dunes, Enoch felt images rise without sensation of effort. He saw the ordered heavens like a spun wheel, the constellations not merely stars but names and judgments, each a lamp fixed for guidance. The voice explained the heavens as a ledger, where actions and promises were recorded, but it did so with an artistry that made math sing. It did not reduce the celestial display to mere calculation, rather it read the sky as a memory of beginnings and a promise of return. He understood then that the cosmos was not indifferent, it responded and registered, and the voice was the means by which the cosmos spoke back to him. The wilderness presented him with metaphors that the voice used to teach him about justice and order. A lone hyena's cry became a parable about corruption. A bird rising from the valley into wind spoke of ascent from ignorance. Enoch listened as a pupil and as a gardener, taking seeds from the voice and planting them where his memory could cultivate them. The epistle that would later be shaped in his mind began as a series of impressions and commands, each one an ember that he carried. Those embers burned as steady convictions rather than flames meant to dazzle. They were intended to steady, to orient a people who had lost their bearings. The voice did not ignore human life. It spoke of cities and kings and the way power tends to fold in upon itself, becoming a shelter for the selfish. The wilderness revelation was not separation but clarification. Enoch was taught to see the city from the outside so he could return inside with eyes that pierced the smoke. The voice made him eyewitness to patterns, how riches accumulate like sediment and how law becomes a net that catches the innocent. There was an urgency in this. The world he was shown could be healed if people could relearn the rhythms of justice and humility. It was not a simple indictment but a call to reformation. At times the voice took on an intimacy that felt like a conversation between old friends, and at times it spoke like a judge unmasking hypocrisy. Enoch learned quickly that the tone shifted according to what needed to be revealed. There were moments when he laughed in the middle of the desert, not from humor alone but from the shock of being understood. Understanding, the voice taught him, is a kind of sanctification. It clears the cobwebs from decision and gives the heart the courage to act. He took these lessons and folded them into his body as if clothing, so that when the cold came he would be warmed by what he had received. In the courses of the revelation, the voice introduced him to the concept of watchers, beings tasked with observation who had strayed from duty. It described them not merely as angels in distant stories but as functions within the moral economy, beings whose power and curiosity had consequences. The tale was not told to inflame but to instruct. Too much curiosity without responsibility becomes a distortion. Enoch heard this with the dread of an inheritor. To be chosen meant bearing knowledge that could be dangerous if misapplied. He felt the burden of fidelity, knowledge's responsibility to the community. Sometimes the voice showed him scenes like paintings that unfolded in the air, a court, a river of light, a city crumbling because those at its center had stopped listening. The images were vivid, tactile. He could smell dust in the crumbling city and hear the scrape of the magistrate's robe. In each vision there was a slow moral calculus, the measuring of deeds and the assigning of consequences, as if the cosmos had an inner ledger. Enoch's role began to feel twofold. He was both a witness to what was and a herald of what ought to be. The voice was shaping not only his knowledge but his vocation, calling him to be an apostle of reorientation. He began to speak to people where he could find them, in camps and by wells, though his voice was modest and hardly the high orator's timbre expected of a prophet. His words carried the calm intimacy of one who had walked with the voice and learned to translate its images into plain narratives. He told stories of the heavens as warning and promise, of watchers who had erred and the need for restitution. Some listened with hunger, because the world had grown tired of slogans and longed for meaning. Others closed their faces as if scorn could keep them safe from truth. But Enoch did not grow impatient. He had been taught that patience is the breeding ground of change. The epistle that would later be associated with his name began as fragments spoken by the fire, notes caught like dried herbs and saved in the memory of those who passed them on. Enoch did not intend to write a treatise in the way a scholar composes. Instead, he taught through parable and example, and his community preserved his words as one preserves a spring. They were not legal codes but moral calls that rang with the ancient cadence of covenant. The voice in the wilderness insisted that righteousness was not merely adherence to law but a disposition toward right relationship. Enoch's speech shaped itself around that idea, and the people received it as a map back to themselves. At night, lying beneath a sky that seemed spun from a single continuous thought, Enoch felt the voice enter into his dreams. Dreams, he learned, were not random residues of day but rooms in which the divine could rearrange memory and hope. In those hours the revelation deepened. He saw the generations like a chain and felt the weight of ancestry and posterity at once. He understood that his first revelation was not a private benefit but a public commission. The future could not be healed without the present being righted. Each dream taught him a new metaphor for teaching: stones that bore names, a tree whose branches counted the years of the righteous, and he catalogued each as if preserving heirlooms. As dawn returned, Enoch often rose with a new clarity of the lesson and a sense of how to carry it into the day. He experienced revelation as both compass and plow. It pointed and it worked. The voice showed him how small acts of repair, mending a fence, reconciling a quarrel, were signs of larger reconciliation, the visible stitching of a frayed social fabric. He learned that righteousness was practical in its filaments, sprawling into domestic life rather than being confined to ceremonial halls. This practicality made the message accessible, and the people who had once been suspicious began to see their lives as fields that could be tended. The wilderness itself seemed an ally in the formation of his courage. Alone among stones and sky, he developed a poise that was neither prideful nor timid, but the steady attention of one who knows both the fragility and the force of human conviction. The voice guided his gaze to the small things, the track of a fox, the growth rings beneath a fallen limb, and from these particulars he drew universal lessons about justice and humility. In this way the revelation avoided abstraction, it remained grounded. Enoch's teachings carried the smell of earth because they had been scraped from the dirt and put back into vocabulary that people could use. There were times of doubt, of course, for no path remains unmarred by hesitation. Enoch learned how to sit with uncertainty without letting it harden into cynicism. He asked the voice questions, sometimes boldly, sometimes with the quiet of a friend seeking clarification, and the replies varied in form. Sometimes the voice answered in the language of parable, sometimes with imagery that left more to feeling than to simple logic. In these exchanges he discovered that faith, when honest, is a conversation rather than a monologue. The voice did not demand blind obedience, it invited reasoning paired with humility. The epistle, as it coalesced, began to articulate a moral arc. The righteous are those who love justice and show mercy, who walk humbly and preserve the order intended by the Maker. This was not a novel concept in the world of lawgivers, yet its expression through Enoch's revelations felt urgent and renewed. The voice insisted that the righteous act in the world as stewards rather than owners, that their dominion is a caretaking, not exploitation. Enoch's words emphasized accountability not as punitive but as restorative, framing correction as the return to a path that had been lost. In listening to him, people found a route away from retribution and toward restoration. He taught that the moral life is measured by the way one treats the vulnerable, those whom society often overlooks, widows, orphans, strangers. In one revelation, the voice set before him a vision of a table where the poor sat with kings, not as a fantasy but as the potential of covenant fulfilled. It explained that the dignity of each person was a sacred text and that to violate it was to dishonor the entire community. Enoch felt these teachings like a warmth that reached into his bones. They were not negotiated claims but essentials of a society that could endure. The people who heard this message found themselves returning to the hearth with new attentiveness. Enoch's role as transmitter was complicated by human frailty. He often encountered leaders who used the language of piety for self-interest, who mistook ceremony for justice. The voice taught him to name hypocrisy with gentleness but firmness, to separate blame from ostracism, and to seek correction where possible. His words cut through pretense not with arrogance but with clarity. He pried at the varnish of decorum until the rot was visible and could be repaired. There is a difficult tenderness in holding leaders accountable, and Enoch had to learn the craft of confrontation that preserves dignity while insisting on truth. As his reputation grew, pilgrims began to seek him out, some with reverence and some with the hunger that accompanies curiosity. They asked questions of doctrine and destiny, about the fate of nations, and about the private sins that kept them awake. Enoch answered with the same skill he used with the land, translating great truths into workaday ethics. He refused to promise easy rescue or to sign rights over to certainty. Instead, he taught practices: repentance that mends relationships, charity that restores dignity, vigilance that prevents corruption. These practices were his epistle's beating heart, the portion meant to be lived daily. One of the clearest images the voice gave him was of a tree planted by a stream, healthy because it had access to life-giving water. The vision sounded simple, but the meaning was layered. Righteousness is not hermetic virtue. It requires connection, sustenance, and the deliberate placement of roots. The tree does not flourish alone. It depends on a place and time and the flow that reaches it. If you translate this into human terms, Enoch realized, it meant creating institutions that preserved flow and protected sources of life for the vulnerable. One of his tasks became the articulation of how communities could structure themselves to keep justice alive, not as an idea but as an accessible resource. The voice gave him laws of imagination as well as laws of action. It taught Enoch that to imagine rightly is to set the stage for action, since people will enact the future they can conceive. He learned to speak of hope not as detached optimism but as a disciplined vision that shapes present choices. This was the artistry of the epistle. It was as much about forming sight as about prescribing behavior. He encouraged people to see the world in terms of covenantal fidelity, to picture themselves as caretakers of a shared garden rather than possessors of a barren empire. Enoch sometimes felt the loneliness of the visionary. To carry images that others cannot yet parse is to be a bridge with no guarantee that crossing will occur. Yet the voice provided company in that loneliness. It offered narratives that lined the hours and maps that guided the feet. He discovered that solitude sharpened his language, making his metaphors cleaner and his appeals more direct. In his solitude, he wrote nothing with ink. Instead, he stored phrases and parables in the memories of those who sat near him. The lack of parchment did not diminish the permanence of what was given. Oral memory can be a crucible for truth, tempered by retelling and refined by the community it serves. Not all visions were gentle. Some came as admonitions, stark as lightning that stops speech. One such vision showed the world as a tapestry being cut by careless hands, threads unraveling because those who should have tended them were gone. The voice explained that neglect accumulates into catastrophe, that small betrayals of covenant become wide separations between neighbor and neighbor. Enoch felt grief like a physical ache at such sights. The revelation included sorrow as much as instruction. He learned that prophetic grief is not mere lamentation but a driving force toward repair. Enoch's image of a courtroom in the heavens, an auditorium of judgment and reconciliation, troubled some listeners who feared condemnation. To them he explained that the court's purpose was not entertainment of doom but the restoration of order. The voice described a process where deeds are measured and then returned in correction so the community might be whole. Justice, in this sense, was restorative law, an ordering that restores balance, reconciles those wronged, and instructs those who erred. This approach did not negate accountability but transformed its purpose from punishment to healing. His first revelation insisted that memory matters. The voice asked Enoch to remember not only laws but the stories that shaped a people's identity, stories of rescue, of fidelity, of failure and return. Memory functions as a moral ledger, and when it is lost, a people become susceptible to repeating destructive patterns. Enoch was told to gather stories as one gathers seeds, preserving them through seasons so that future generations could plant them rightly. The epistle grew into a repository of such stories, each parable a seed intended for a different soil and season. At times, the revelations took on the character of instruction for leadership. The voice counseled rulers to see power as a trust, to measure authority by service. This teaching was often countercultural. Rulers had grown used to seeing dominion as entitlement. Enoch spoke against that arrogance with the soft force of someone who had been to the edge and looked back. He explained that rulers who lead by tender service prolong their reigns and expand their people's flourishing. This message attracted both sincere reformers and those who merely wanted to adorn themselves in the language of humility. The wilderness experience sharpened his ear for contradictions. He would sit beneath the stars and hear in the cities rumble the paradox of abundance beside scarcity. The voice taught him to trace these discrepancies to their root causes: greed that immunizes itself with ideology, fear that dresses itself up as protection, ritual that replaces relationship. Enoch's rhetorical skill grew in telling stories that stripped away these disguises, showing how the same behavior could be read as devotion or as abuse depending on intention. He began to function as both mirror and scalpel, reflecting the people's true shape and cutting away pretense for the sake of health. There was tenderness in his teachings about the fragile human heart. The voice counseled patience with frailty, but not complacency about it. People are prone to brokenness, and healing is a communal labor that requires patience and a framework of accountability. Enoch taught that systems should be designed to restore rather than discard, to reintegrate rather than isolate. He used the image of a shepherd carrying the limping sheep back to the fold, a small, humble image that contained the governance of both law and mercy. That image resonated widely because it offered a workable ethic for daily life. People who had suffered injustice found in his words both recognition and solace. Enoch became an advocate for those whose complaints had been muted by the din of power. The voice in him provided language to describe indignity that otherwise goes unnamed, so that grievances could be voiced and addressed. Enoch's presence at times was catalytic. Wounds were acknowledged, apologies given, and reparations considered. Not every story ended in reconciliation, but many did, and this incremental healing reinforced the credibility of his message. He also faced resistance from those whose livelihoods depended on the status quo. Wealthy merchants and unscrupulous officials disliked a message that suggested their prosperity be redirected toward the welfare of the many. They called him an agitator, some even a destabilizer, and they conspired to silence his influence. Enoch accepted opposition as the cost of fidelity. It sharpened his resolve and clarified the nature of his mission. The voice had cautioned him that truth often invites both embrace and backlash, and he learned to hold both with a steady heart. Despite the tensions, there were moments of joy so fierce they felt sacramental. A woman reconciled with her estranged son, a communal well repaired and shared, a quarrel between neighbors resolved with renewed trust. These small consecrations lit the face of the community. Enoch observed these moments with a gratitude that resembled prayer. The voice taught him that joy binds memory and becomes the engine of hope. It is not a trivial emotion but a covenantal resource that fuels sustained goodness. He collected such moments and retold them, letting the community's own successes become part of their lore. As the seasons turned, his epistle grew more structured in theme if not in formal written shape. He gathered his core teachings and framed them as pathways rather than commandments alone. There is a difference between a command and a route. The latter assumes movement, a journey to be traversed with companions. Enoch's style favored routes because he wanted people to travel together, to share the burden and discover the way collectively. He spoke of disciplines, patterns of living that reinforced virtues, habits that tend the soil of the soul. The voice, in one of its quieter moments, revealed to him a vision of the end of arrogance. It did not present a scene of cataclysm for spectacle, but of a dismantling that allowed for repair. Empires built on the backs of the vulnerable would not simply be demolished, but reshaped into cities that welcomed and housed those they once exploited. The conception was radical because it maintained the dignity of even those who had erred, insisting on their restoration rather than their annihilation. Enoch felt a fierce hope in this prognosis. It was not utopian fantasy, but an oriented possibility tied to choice and repentance. He learned, too, that revelation can be a pedagogy for the senses. The voice taught him how smell and taste and touch function as moral teachers. Food, for example, is not only sustenance but a sign of community when shared fairly. The breaking of bread becomes a moral act because it embodies distribution and regard for the other. Enoch preached about feasts and fasts as spiritual grammar, a way of encoding values into bodily practice. This attention to the senses made his teaching tactile and lived. People could practice righteousness with their hands as well as their thoughts. The wilderness sometimes sent him away from human settlements into caves where echoes lengthened words and made them holy. There, alone with stone and the echoes of his own voice, he rehearsed the speech that would bring comfort or admonition to others. Silence in those caverns was not emptiness but a listening posture in which the voice could be sharpened. It taught him the discipline of reticence, knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work of persuasion. People appreciated this restraint. His words that followed silence landed like well-placed stones across a river. Enoch found that the most important education was the slow disentangling of fear from faith. Fear often masquerades as piety, preventing risk and petrifying institutions. Faith, by contrast, calls for risk to love, to repair, to trust. The voice counseled him to cultivate courage that is not bravado but quiet endurance. He embodied this courage in small acts of reconciliation, and facing powerful opponents with steady eyes, and the patient articulation of difficult truths. Courage multiplied because it was modeled for others, becoming contagious rather than coercive. His audience evolved over time as the message traveled through different social strata. Initially drawn from small tribes and families, then from merchants and town dwellers, the epistle's reach broadened as people shared it with travelers. Travelers bore stories like mirrors, reflecting Enoch's teachings into new markets and distant camps. In this way, the wilderness voice found roads and rivers and rode with merchants, turning private revelation into public conversation. The evolution was organic. The message did not impose itself but spread by usefulness and resonance. Despite his growing influence, Enoch remained attuned to the humility embedded in the revelation. The voice would remind him often, the tree must know its root. He avoided the vanity that often accompanies notoriety by retreating periodically to places of solitude. These retreats were not escapes but replenishments, necessary for a teacher who had to speak truth into exhaustion. He taught his followers the art of withdrawal and return, to be present in work and to recover in silence, mirroring the wilderness rhythms that had birthed his calling. The epistle emphasized time as a moral category. The voice taught Enoch to see time not as enemy but as partner, an expanse in which repair can be enacted slowly yet faithfully. Generations, therefore, become co-authors of a moral future, and the present is tasked with writing legibly for those who follow. This view resisted instant fixes and quick triumphs, preferring steady cultivation that yields enduring harvests. Enoch's teachings encouraged patience not as resignation but as a strategic discipline for long-term flourishing. He found that reconciliation often began with listening, an activity more active than it appears. Listening requires setting aside one's agenda and receiving the other's narrative fully, even when it wounds. The voice taught him that listening is itself a sacrament because it acknowledges the other's existence and dignity. Enacting restorative justice begins with this simple but profound attentiveness. Enoch practiced listening publicly and privately, and his caution with words became a hallmark of his credibility. There were moments when revelation seemed to anticipate future anxieties and give counsel that would prove resilient across ages. The voice warned against the idolatry of efficiency, valuing speed and output above people. It predicted the social fractures that accompany such prioritization, the marginalization of the human being in service to performance. He taught measures that protect people from being reduced to their productivity, Sabbaths, public festivals, shared meals. These practices were protective frameworks, humane institutions to resist the erosion of communal affection. The voice also instructed Enoch on the use of symbols, how to employ them so they help rather than deceive. Symbols can simplify and clarify, but they can also freeze into empty relics. He learned to reanimate symbols with fresh content. The table that once divided was reframed as an icon of welcome, the throne as a seat of service. The epistle thus became a kind of hermeneutic, teaching people how to read their rituals and to restore meaning where it had faded. This renewed symbolism bound daily life to cosmic purpose. Enoch's teachings found particular expression in his attitudes toward leadership transition. He counseled that authority should be distributed and that succession should not be entrepreneurial but communal. This proposal unsettled many accustomed to dynastic certainty, but it gained traction among those who feared consolidation of power. The voice offered a vision of leadership as stewardship in time, where the leader hands over a healthy garden rather than a draining machine. Such institutional wisdom proved useful in preventing the corruption that unchecked power breeds. Nature continued to be an integral teacher in his revelations. He often pointed to the slow work of rivers and the patient accretion of soil as models for moral progress. Nature's pacing is not indifference but a steady rhythm that invites us to join. He told parables of seasons as moral metaphors, where winter is a time of pruning and spring a time of resowing. These natural images made the epistle accessible to people who lived by the land and reminded everyone that moral life requires patience and timing. The voice sometimes introduced paradox to test his interpretive skill, strength in gentleness, victory in surrender, authority through service. These paradoxes are not sophistry, they are experiential truths that radicalize common sense. Enoch's rhetorical genius was to render paradox persuasive through story and example rather than through oratory alone. He lived these paradoxes, demonstrating how a leader's humility could strengthen community bonds and how forgiveness could safeguard against cycles of revenge. Over time, living such paradoxes became a communal ethic that retained its dialectic rather than capitulating to easy answers. He taught that prophecy itself is a form of companionship with the future. To prophesy is to stand alongside coming generations and lead them moral guidance. The voice called him not to fearful prediction but to a wisdom that shapes futures by adjusting present habits. Therefore, the epistle is not only an oracle but a manual of communal care. It does not promise perfect outcomes but insists upon faithful means. Some critics accused him of nostalgia, longing for an imagined past that never quite existed. Enoch rebutted this gently, clarifying that his call was not to recreate a mythic age, but to recover durable moral practices that had been neglected. He distinguished between romanticizing the past and rescuing its virtues, hospitality, honesty, restraint, so they could be repurposed for present tasks. This nuance satisfied some skeptics and frustrated others who wanted black and white pronouncements. He accepted the friction as part of the higher work of clarifying reality through nuance. Enoch also taught about fear of scarcity, explaining how it drives a society into hoarding and protectionism. The voice modeled abundance as trust, trust not naive but cultivated by practices that share resources and protect the vulnerable. Instinct to hoard is natural, but morality teaches us to channel such instincts into institutions that prevent scarcity from harming the weakest. Enoch recommended structures of mutual aid and public provision as moral technologies to counteract the narrowing of heart that scarcity induces. These proposals were practical in tone, not utopian in demand. His epistle addressed the problem of memory loss, not just historical amnesia but forgetting one's own commitments. The voice gave him liturgies and remembrances designed to keep covenantal commitments alive across time, feasts that commemorate saving acts, rituals that periodically reorient priorities, narrations that bind children to elders' wisdom. These practices were not rigid because they matured with communities, but they resisted the rapid forgetting that allows injustice to calcify. He encouraged public calendars that preserve moral storylines and private practices that remind individuals of their duties. There were confessional moments in the Revelation when the voice asked Enoch to inspect himself and name his own failings. The humility to confess was itself a spiritual discipline. Enoch modeled confession publicly at times and privately at others, showing that accountability must begin with self. The voice insisted that prophetic authority is invalid without moral self-scrutiny. A leader's words ring false if their life remains unchecked. Enoch's admissions of weakness lent his speech authenticity and transformed him from a distant oracle into a believable guide. The voice also lifted Enoch's gaze to the interconnectedness of worlds. It taught him that what one generation authorizes will echo into the next and that human actions ripple through social and ecological systems. Responsibility therefore extends beyond immediate consequences into the stewardship of lineage. Enoch learned to speak in temporal webs, linking today's practice to tomorrow's possibilities. The epistle thus contains a sense of long-term care, insisting that choices be judged not only by present benefit but by future flourishing. Sometimes the revelation took the form of aphorisms, short, sharp sayings that carry a lifetime of application. They were not empty slogans but condensed experiences meant to be unpacked and lived through. Enoch used them sparingly, knowing their power to be both clarifying and misleading when detached from context. He taught that aphorisms must be embedded in story and practice, and he resisted their becoming dogmatic mantras. Thus the epistle balanced brief sayings with narrative texture, ensuring that wisdom was both portable and substantive. There were episodes where the voice exposed the spiritual cost of indifference. Indifference, it said, corrodes the moral imagination and makes people passive in the face of suffering. Often it is comfort that anesthetizes compassion. Enoch saw how people accommodate evil by retreating into the lesser pain of ignoring. The voice provoked him to wake the sleeping consciences of his listeners, to call them toward engagement that risks cost but yields community. He became a voice that rattled complacency in quiet ways, urging action through moral discomfort that was proportionate and constructive. Enoch's teaching about repentance was practical rather than abstract. He explained repentance as a turn measured by concrete acts of repair, not merely inner remorse. Repentance, when sincere, binds people together because it seeks to restore relationships rather than merely appease guilt. He urged public and personal acts of restitution. The voice described restitution not as impossible heaviness but as the necessary currency of reconciliation, a cost that transforms tragedy into renewed trust. At the same time, Enoch was careful about promising cosmic certainties. The voice taught him the humility to avoid definitive speculation about the unknowable, focusing instead on duties that remain visible to our hands. People wanted answers to mysteries, and he often provided wisdom about how to live under uncertainty rather than comforting false certitudes. His leadership held tension between the human craving for certainty and an ethical commitment to honest limitation. This modest posture earned him respect, especially among those wary of tidy prophetic claims. There were poetic visions that lingered like incense in his memory, a procession of the righteous walking toward a mountain, a sea that receded to reveal a path of stones, a lamp that refused to go out despite wind and rain. These images were not literal roadmaps but moral beacons, guiding hearts through metaphor toward resolute practice. They were the repertoire of the epistle, the language by which moral imagination is kindled. People remember images more easily than arguments, and Enoch's images have the power to reorient the heart. Enoch discovered that mentorship was as important as proclamation. He trained a few trusted companions in the art of listening to the voice and of translating revelation into communal practice. These apprentices learned not only the content of the teaching but the demeanor required to deliver it, patience, precision, and a heart tuned toward repair. In doing so, Enoch multiplied his capacity to influence without inflating his ego, creating a network of moral interpreters rather than a cult of personality. The voice had intended this from the beginning. Revelation shared is revelation preserved. Controversy followed his methods, as it often does when habits of centuries are questioned. Critics accused him of undermining tradition by calling for changes that threatened established interests. Enoch's response was neither revolutionary rhetoric nor timid concession. He argued that tradition gains strength when it is purified by justice. Rituals that celebrate the powerless rather than empower the powerful will endure, he said, because they maintain the vitality of moral memory. This conservative restorative posture appealed to many who longed for meaningful continuity rather than mere preservation of form. The voice revealed to him a final set of imperatives: humility, justice, charity, and vigilance. Each was framed not as a checklist but as a way of being, a grammar of community life. Humility keeps leaders from making idols of themselves. Justice orders relations so that power serves rather than praise. Charity distributes resources and dignity. Vigilance prevents the gradual corrosion of goodness. Enoch presented these virtues not as abstractions but as disciplines practiced in bread-breaking and market pricing, and lawmaking and dispute resolution. They were the backbone of the epistle's moral anatomy. He remained aware that revelation can be misused, knowledge without charity becomes cold, and rules without empathy become chains. The voice warned that those who hold revelation must do so gently, keeping it from becoming a weapon of domination. Enoch understood that his authority was derivative and conditional, and he modeled a stewardship that could be relinquished if it became destructive. This voluntary restraint was perhaps his greatest lesson about power, that true authority is ready to die to itself for the sake of life. The wilderness and its voice had shaped him into a transmitter of a living ethic, not a sterile system. He did not craft dogma, he cultivated a moral culture that could be passed, adapted, and renewed. The epistle he inspired was therefore flexible in form yet firm in core commitments. It could be taught in parable, practiced in community, and embodied by leaders who wore humility. People found in it a route out of cynicism and into active, communal repair. As years passed, stories of his revelation circulated far beyond the initial circles, echoed by travelers, recounted at fires, and translated into local idioms. The core message, justice tempered by mercy and anchored in humility, found fertile ground in many hearts. Some preserved the teachings as poetry, some as law, and some as ritual practice, but the through line remained: the voice in the wilderness had spoken a way to live together more faithfully. Enoch, for his part, kept walking between solitude and speech, allowing revelation to renew him while he refused to become its idol. In the end, his first revelation remained a starting point rather than a singular summit. It opened a trajectory for his life and for the communities that embraced it, but it did not provide all answers or foreclose all dissent. That was part of its beauty and its realism. Revelation is an initiation into a lifelong apprenticeship with truth. Enoch's epistle, born of wind and stone and patient listening, became an enduring conversation between voice and world. one that continues to invite those willing to walk into the wilderness with attentive feet and open hearts. There is an old voice in the world that moves like wind over a desert, patient and full of memory, and it is in that voice we begin our journey to the tablets of fire. Picture a man named Enoch, not as a portrait in a frame, but as a corridor of light and shadow that people have walked through for centuries, carrying the story forward on their tongues. He is both a figure out of the dawn of things and a mirror in which later ages have seen their questions reflected, questions about justice, destiny, and the secret instructions given to those called the righteous ones. Enoch's tale comes to us in fragments and proclamations, embedded in texts that feel like memories rather than histories, like the afterimage of a star burned onto the inside of the eyelid. The Epistle of the Righteous, one piece of this larger constellation of writings, reads like a letter stitched from both warning and consolation, delivered to those who still believe that moral order has a voice. That voice speaks about tablets, not of hammered copper or carved stone, but of fire, tablets that contain laws, names, and the geometry of a moral universe that will survive decay. The fire in Enoch's words still burns for anyone who listens. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you feel that flame more as a warning for what's coming or as a light that still guides the world. Imagine the tablets of fire as objects that are less material than they are insistences, a kind of carved insistence on what must not be forgotten. They are presented in the texts as coming from a place beyond ordinary sight, given to Enoch in the frequencies where heaven and earth overlap, where language can be sharpened into commands that reshape human deliberation. When Enoch receives them, the narrative tells us, it is as if the cosmos has decided to entrust a ledger to a human heart, an accountability that feels both terrifying and carefully intimate. We are asked to listen to the tone of these documents as if they were both legal declaration and lullaby, a double voice that instructs and soothes. The Epistle of the Righteous is framed as a heritage, an inheritance of discipline and hope chiseled into fire so that it cannot easily perish. The people who hear about these tablets are those who consider themselves custodians of covenant and conscience, people who want to live as if ethics were not a matter of choice but a fact of the world. Enoch stands at the center, a mediator who translates celestial law into speech that human ears can bear. He is described as a scribe of the invisible court, someone who steps between cosmic order and human frailty. His pen is not simply ink but a compass for the restless spirit. He charts paths away from arrogance and toward humility, away from cruelty and toward mercy, and in doing so he produces a map for life under the light of those enduring tablets. The righteous ones in this story are not only the pious and remote, they are the ones who carry patience like armor and act like gardeners of justice in a world that can seem relentlessly hungry. They are portrayed as inheritors of a moral technology that teaches how to handle temptation, sorrow, and the small betrayals by which communities fall apart. The epistle instructs them with crisp directives about speech, desire, and the stewardship of life, and in each instruction there is a sense that character is more durable than circumstance. Consider the images the text invokes: cities that wilt or blossom according to how the righteous behave, seasons of prosperity and drought that answer to human conduct, and families that either remember their pacts or are swallowed by forgetting. The tablets, forged in fire, are thought to be imperishable because they record a covenant between the most enduring elements of reality, law and love. Enoch's role is to bring us into a conversation about how to balance fear and courage, law and grace, preservation and transformation. There is also a dramatic element about the giving of the tablets that must be felt rather than simply understood. The moments when Enoch receives revelations are described as corridors of light opening into halls of judgment, or like an old library that unfurls page after page of the soul. There is an intimacy to those scenes. Enoch does not simply read commands, he learns the rhythm of the world, the cadence of seasons, and the pattern by which mercy returns. The tablets are less a code than a living lesson, meant to train perception as much as action. For listeners balancing a steering wheel or a steaming kettle, the narrative keeps returning to the idea that spiritual knowledge is fundamentally practical. The Epistle of the Righteous is full of parables about the everyday, how a neighbor is to be treated, how wealth ought to be carried, how anger is to be measured. What makes Enoch's instruction compelling is its refusal to separate high theology from daily behavior. The tablets insist that holiness is not a separate compartment but a way of moving through ordinary life with attention. The soundscape of these teachings is important. The text abounds in auditory metaphors, voices that ring like bronze, whispers that bruise, songs that restore. This is fitting, because the giving of law often arrives as a message meant to be heard and repeated. Enoch becomes a conduit of resonance, passing along a tone that corrects distortion and aligns listeners' hearing with what the tablets declare. The righteous ones are those who learn to listen until their judgment itself is tuned. Often, narratives about Enoch and his writings pivot to accusations and difficulties. The world in which the tablets appear is a world that needs correction. The epistle records laments for violence, for the misuse of power, for communities that forget their obligations to the weak. Enoch's writing frames these evils not as cosmic accidents but as failures of remembrance, failures to keep the fire's inscription alive in the heart. The tablets thus become not a punitive catalog but a mnemonic device to refocus collective memory. There is an ethical psychology embedded in the text that reads like an instruction manual for the inner life. The righteous are encouraged to cultivate attentiveness to conscience as a faculty that can be trained, polished, and expanded. The tablets contain aphorisms about patience and foresight, about the subtle ways that honor is preserved or dissipated, and each rule seems designed to help a person develop a spiritual muscle, a habit of being that resists the corrosive influences of self-centeredness. Enoch's portrait has a striking ambiguity that keeps the narrative lively. In some passages he is a prophet of terrifying clarity, announcing a future of reckoning. In others he is a gentle teacher, coaxing people toward modesty and communal repair. This oscillation reveals something about the nature of the tablets themselves. They are not merely manuals for punishment, they are instruments of reorientation, offering both admonition and consolation, a balance of correction with an invitation to return to a life that bears fruit. The tablet's imagery often folds into metaphors of light and warmth, of fire both consuming and preserving. Here the paradox is crucial: fire destroys what is corrupt, yet it also forges and refines what is true. The righteous ones, when they receive this fire, are disciplined against a complacency that mistakes comfort for righteousness. The epistle presses them to be vigilant, to polish their actions as a smith polishes steel, to be ready for the moment when choices will test the strength that practice has built. You sense in the writing a moral seriousness that does not flatten into dourness. The tablets speak of joy as a fruit of faithfulness, of celebration as a proper response to covenant kept. Enoch's voice alternates firm directives with descriptive scenes of feasting and community, so that the moral life appears attractive rather than merely dutiful. In this way the writings cultivate desire toward beauty, justice, and deep relationships, so that the righteous are driven by longing, not only by compulsion. As the narrative unfurls, you meet obstacles that complicate the initial certainty of the tablets. There are false teachers, secret impulses, and social systems that resist ethical reform. The epistle warns that the world is apt to twist any clear counsel into a convenient excuse, and it charges the righteous to be diagnosticians of hypocrisy. Enoch teaches them to detect the subtle forms of self-deception that masquerade as piety, to read human motives with the same precision the tablets demand for reading the law. This diagnostic practice becomes almost forensic in tone. The letter invites readers to examine their motives under a light that unmasks rationalizations and names them for what they are. To be righteous, the epistle says, is to embrace a transparency that can be painful but ultimately liberating. It is a willingness to let volatile feelings be steadied by truth. Enoch's language for this process is often blunt but never vindictive, more like a surgeon's steady hand than a judge's gavel. The epistle also explores the responsibility of leadership and the consequences when leaders forget the tablet's counsel. There are portraits of rulers who hoard justice like a commodity and of judges who pervert the law for personal gain. These passages are not just political critique, they are moral geography, mapping the ways corruption spreads when those in charge fail to live in accordance with the fire's inscriptions. Enoch warns that the fate of many is bound to the virtue of a few, and thus the tablets demand fidelity from those who hold influence. Enoch's narrative rhythm often returns to the theme of covenant, an agreement that is both vertical, between humans and the divine, and horizontal, among members of a community. The tablets of fire encode obligations that aim to keep those covenants alive. The epistle treats covenant as an operation of binding and freeing at the same time, binding people to principles that free them from the chaos of fleeting appetites and self-serving shortcuts, and freeing them into relationships that sustain life over generations. There is tenderness in the epistle when it contemplates families and lineage. The tablets instruct parents and elders to teach children the names and narratives that ground a people. This is not mere nostalgia but a recognition that moral identity is transmitted through stories and practices as much as through direct instruction. Enoch's emphasis on transmission traces a chain of attention, how each link, if cared for, guarantees that wisdom will persist beyond a single lifespan. Language matters deeply in these texts, and so the Epistle of the Righteous spends time instructing its readers about the weight of words. Speech is described as an instrument capable of either building altars or burning bridges. The tablets treat truth-telling as a form of worship and slander as sacrilege, urging the righteous to cultivate speech that heals, clarifies, and affirms rather than speech that destroys. Enoch insists that the sound of a person's voice can be as instructive as any carved tablet. Alongside rules about speech, there are keen warnings about wealth and how it can distort the moral imagination. The epistle does not preach austerity for its own sake but argues for proportionality and stewardship. The tablets of fire demand that abundance be held with an open hand, used to repair and nourish, not to isolate or to dominate. In doing so, they offer a countercultural ethic in which prosperity measures itself by generosity rather than by accumulation. Enoch's writings also reach into the private theater of conscience, where temptation and fear play out as intimate dramas. The epistle speaks to the moments when a person is tempted to excuse small wrongs because they seem pragmatically useful. It coaches the righteous to view such compromises as seeds that will grow into larger harms. This psychological insight connects the cosmic significance of the tablets to the micro-decisions of daily life, making morality a continuous practice rather than a set of episodic victories. Perhaps one of the most haunting motifs is that of judgment, which appears in vigorous and multifaceted ways. The tablets do not speak only of external retribution, they predict inner reckonings where a person must confront the tally of their choices. Enoch's visions paint judgment as an unveiling, hidden deeds are made visible, intentions are inspected, and the cumulative patterns of a life are laid bare. But judgment is also presented as restorative, an exposure that allows wrongs to be set right and communities to breathe again. It is useful to hear how the epistle dialogues with hope within the same breath as warning. The tablets instruct toward a future where the world aligns more fully with justice, and the language of promise is woven through the admonitions. This hope is not naive, it is durable in the sense that it is grounded in practical habits and communal disciplines. Enoch teaches that a world of genuine hope is built by people who are steady in small acts, who refuse the seduction of immediate gain, and who keep faith with the slow work of repair. The righteous one's existence, as depicted, is never isolated from cosmic events. The tablets place their conduct into a wider cosmic scaffolding. The epistle often links earthly choices with cosmic order, suggesting that human morality resonates beyond the immediate scene. This cosmology gives ethical behavior a kind of echo. It matters because it participates in the ordering of the whole, and thus the righteous are entrusted with a responsibility that exceeds their personal benefit. Enoch's account thus enhances the weight of daily choices without making them unbearable. Because the tablets are said to be of fire, they are involved with purification as well as instruction. The imagery of cleansing is not a quick rinse but a deep refining process where alloy is removed and base intentions are exposed. The righteous are expected to enter this refining with courage, not because they are sinless but because they are committed to becoming truer reflections of the ideals the tablets name. The epistle's metaphors of heat and trial serve to encourage endurance through difficulty, reframing hardship as a site of formation. The texts suggest that part of the tablet's function is to create a language for moral imagination, to equip people not only to act rightly but to imagine differently. This imagination is cultivated through story, ritual, and repetition. It is the inner rehearsal of what justice feels like. Enoch's work includes stories that have the capacity to train desire for the right things, and through them the righteous learn to sense injustice as a wound that must be tended. These stories become a rehearsal space for mercy. Ritual appears as another thread, and the epistle emphasizes practices that bind community members to truth. These rituals are not mere formalities, they are embodied reminders of covenantal obligations. By repeating words and gestures, people make a visible and persistent commitment to the values on the tablets. Enoch's tone here is pragmatic. Ritual matters because human memory is fallible, and embodied practices help embed moral truths into the muscles of a people. In the course of transmission, the texts themselves are treated as fragile and subject to misinterpretation. Enoch cautions that the tablets' meanings can be clouded by those who read them only as symbols of power or prestige. The epistle therefore trains its readers in hermeneutics of a kind, a disciplined method of reading that resists reductionism and seeks the heart of instruction. This attention to interpretation is an ethic in itself, because how one reads sacred instructions shapes how one acts upon them. There are passages that read like intimate counsel to the fearful, addressing anxieties about mortality and the unknown. The tablets, Enoch insists, orient people against despair by offering a moral structure that promises continuity beyond individual fragility. Yet this promise asks for reciprocity. The righteous must live into the hope they have been given. The effect is to make faith feel less like a passive waiting and more like an active stewardship of anticipation. Enoch's epistles are not merely lessoning of fear, they cultivate courage in a specific direction. The righteous are urged to stand with the vulnerable, to speak truth to power, and to risk reputation for the sake of justice. Courage here is portrayed as a craft rather than an explosive event, shaped by incremental acts of fidelity. The tablets of fire are thus both inspiring and disciplining, teaching how to be brave without becoming reckless. The narrative also pays attention to exile and displacement, to the pain of those who are uprooted by injustice or catastrophe. The epistle addresses such people with tenderness, framing the tablets as a companion to the wandering. Enoch's language offers consolation without complacency, acknowledging suffering while insisting on the moral possibility of restoration. This dual recognition creates a form of solidarity in the text that is neither sentimental nor detached. Friendship and companionship emerge as vital themes, as the epistle urges the righteous to cultivate relationships that can sustain moral fidelity. These are friendships formed around shared practices and mutual accountability, not alliances based solely on convenience or gain. The tablets present community as a protective lattice that holds individuals while they do the often lonely work of ethical living. Enoch's vision of friendship is robust. It expects vulnerability and rewards resilience. The text pays careful attention to the arts of apology and repair, teaching methods for reconciliation that are slow but substantial. Forgiveness is not a matter of mere words, it is a labor that restores trust and rebuilds the conditions for flourishing. The epistle gives patterns for confession, restitution, and the patient labor of rebuilding reputations by cumulative right action. These methods make clear that justice and mercy belong together, that righting a wrong requires both correction and tender rebuilding. There is also a persistent theme of naming and identity. The tablets of fire are full of names, names of virtues, names of dangers, names of people and places that matter to the covenant. Naming, in Enoch's context, is an act of power because it shapes perception and destiny. To name rightly is to see rightly, which is to act rightly. Therefore, the epistle trains readers in the discipline of precise naming, a practice that tightens moral clarity and prevents ambiguity from creating excuses for wrongdoing. The pedagogical tone of the epistle often reads like a conversation between generations. Enoch addresses not only contemporaries but descendants, as if the tablets are a lineage of instruction passing through time. This intergenerational conversation frames ethics as continuity rather than innovation for its own sake. The righteous are called to be trustees of a story whose coherence depends on transmission, on the patient teaching of habits across years. There are moments when the epistle takes a metaphysical turn, inviting contemplation of cosmic hierarchies and the nature of angels and watchful powers. Within the narrative, these beings are sometimes friends, sometimes warnings, and sometimes functional aspects of how justice is administered beyond human sight. The tablets present a cosmos woven with intelligences that respond to human fidelity, and Enoch acts as a translator who helps his people understand how human acts echo through such a world. The descriptions are meant to expand wonder without displacing practical moral obligations. This interplay between the seen and unseen gives the narrative a layered texture. Morality is not only social but also metaphysical. And yet the epistle never allows metaphysical speculation to become an escape from ethical responsibility. Enoch's voice uses the invisible to reinforce the visible. What you do in your commonplace life matters in deeper arenas. The tablets thus unify experience, connecting everyday choices with larger realities in a way that adds significance rather than abstraction. The rhetoric of the epistle often uses contrast to sharpen its teaching: light and darkness, fidelity and betrayal, harvest and famine. These contrasts prevent complacency by showing how choices lead to divergent futures. Enoch is unafraid to draw these lines clearly, but he also leaves room for complexity, acknowledging that sensible people will sometimes find themselves in ambiguous situations. The tablets provide criteria, not brittle formulas, encouraging discernment and care. Music, tone, and cadence are frequent metaphors in the text, and it's easy to see why. Moral life has rhythms that must be learned and kept. The epistle advises cultivating a tempo of generosity, patience, and attentiveness, a rhythm that resists the quickening beat of self-interest. Enoch's images often return to the idea that the soul is a vessel that can be tuned, and the tablets are the tuning fork that helps it find the correct pitch. This metaphor encourages a lifelong apprenticeship in attunement. The narrative preserves a sense of humility about human knowledge. Even the righteous are seen as learners who will never fully master the truth but can steadily approach it. The tablets offer practices that make wisdom possible, not guarantees that wisdom will be achieved. Enoch's humility is pedagogical. He invites people to a posture of dependence and discipline rather than clogging the path with arrogance. In doing so, he models the very virtues he exhorts others to practice. Ethical imagination in the epistle is often dramatized through parable-like episodes. These short scenes function as moral laboratories where readers witness cause and effect, intention and consequence. The parables avoid moralizing by showing rather than telling, and they allow listeners to inhabit the emotional terrain of the characters involved. Enoch's talent as a storyteller is evident in these moments. He makes moral education both gripping and memorable. Community structures receive careful scrutiny too, with attention to how institutions either uphold or pervert the tablet's values. The epistle does not ask for dissolution of structures but for their reformation, urging leaders to design systems that foster justice. Enoch's proposals emphasize the importance of accessible justice, care for the marginalized, and checks against accumulation of unchecked power. The tablets are therefore not anti-institutional, they are institutional sanity enacted through moral rules and participatory practices. The epistle is also a text of consolation for the oppressed, offering theological language that equips sufferers with dignity rather than resignation. It reframes suffering as not entirely meaningless, as a place where careful moral witness can be displayed and history can be reoriented toward justice. Enoch's consolation is not a sop to passivity, it is an insistence that suffering, when met with truth and solidarity, can become a seedbed of conversion in the wider community. The tablets thus inspire a resilient hope that refuses despair. The righteous are repeatedly instructed to refuse scapegoating and to develop modes of empathy that resist easy division. Enoch decries systems that create villains to avoid addressing structural failures, and he urges careful interrogation of causes rather than the symbolic punishment of individuals. The epistle's moral clarity in this regard is striking. It encourages examination of roots rather than satisfaction with tidy culprits. This orientation fosters a corrective moral wisdom that sees the complexity of social malaise. Education is a recurring concern. The tablets of fire demand a pedagogy that shapes character as much as intellect. Enoch insists that instruction should be integrated with moral formation, that knowledge without transformation is brittle. Schools, families, and communities are called to teach habits that produce integrity, fidelity in small things, truth in speech, generosity in deed. This holistic approach to education gives the righteous tools to live out the tablet's principles across contexts. Ethical action, in the epistle, is neither purely individual nor purely collective. It is a dynamic interplay where each person's fidelity amplifies communal health. Enoch presents a vision where each act participates in the moral economy, either adding to a legacy of flourishing or depleting it. The tablets teach that goodness multiplies, one gracious act makes reciprocity more likely, and patterns of kindness create communities resistant to breakdown. This vision is hopeful without being utopian, acknowledging that moral repair is gradual but real. Time itself is treated as sacred in this literature. The tablets lay out rhythms of remembering and renewal, days, seasons, and rituals that create temporal structures for moral practice. Enoch's attention to temporal cultivation insists that human beings are formed by repetition across years, and that the custodianship of practices helps anchor memory. These temporal scaffolds prevent ethical amnesia by providing recurring opportunities for recommitment and correction. Dreams and visions are not incidental, they are pedagogical tools that both the epistle and Enoch's broader tradition use to reveal moral realities. Visions do not replace deliberation, they supply imaginative material for reflection and action. Enoch's visionary experiences are presented as invitations to wider sympathy and comprehension, not as private revelations that exempt one from communal accountability. The tablets, then, translate visionary insight into practices that others can adopt and test. There is a frequent insistence on the integrity of witness. Testimony must be accurate, consistent, and courageous, and the tablets elevate the act of faithful testimony as a public good. Enoch's ethos valorizes people who stand by the truth amid pressure or danger, portraying them as necessary bulwarks against societal rot. The epistle thus connects personal credibility with the health of the body politic. A community that cannot trust its witnesses cannot maintain covenant. Mercy is not a soft alternative in these texts, but a disciplined virtue that requires intelligence and courage. The tablets teach that mercy without justice is indulgence, but justice without mercy is brutality. The two must be held together. Enoch's moral imagination shows how mercy can be institutionalized without being routinized, achieving the delicate balance between tenderness and accountability. The righteous are therefore trained in practices that make mercy operational and sustainable. The epistle also considers the interior dispositions necessary for moral persistence: humility, patience, gratitude, and a steady hope. These are not presented as abstract ideals, but as concrete aids in the struggle against corruption and despair. Enoch encourages the cultivation of these virtues through daily practices and communal reinforcements until they become second nature. The result is a kind of moral endurance that does not rely on rare heroics, but on persistent fidelity. The rhetorical style of the epistle uses repetition and parallelism to engrave its lessons into memory, and the tablets of fire are imagined as instruments that help internalize those repetitions. Enoch's writing is economical in imagery but lavish in consequence, each sentence functioning like a steady hammer blow until a shape emerges in the reader's conscience. The cumulative effect is both poetic and pragmatic, a mounting call to consistent, principled living. Enoch's authority in the narrative is neither coercive nor thinly charismatic. It is rooted in historical imagination and spiritual clarity. He is portrayed as someone whose moral coherence arises from a life practiced in the disciplines he recommends. The tablets are not dependent on his personality. They stand as standards beyond him, standards that can be adopted and adapted if faithfully interpreted. This diffuses any temptation to idolize Enoch and keeps attention on the substance of the teaching. Pilgrimage is another motif threaded through the text, representing journeys of moral formation that require leaving comforts behind. The righteous are encouraged to walk familiar ways with new attention, to turn travel into a school for humility and learning. These pilgrimages are metaphorical and literal, spanning both inner transformation and outward acts of solidarity with those who are marginalized. The travel cane of the righteous is patience, and every step is a lesson. Resistance to the systems of oppression appears in many guises, from quiet acts of refusal to organized efforts for reform. The epistle speaks to both the solitary conscience and the collective movement, teaching methods of nonviolent resistance that emphasize dignity and truth. Enoch models a courage that is both prophetic and constructive, calling for an active stance that builds alternatives rather than merely condemning the existing order. These sections inspire a disciplined activism that refuses despair. The tablet's instructions about mourning and memory are tender and precise, offering rituals for grief that keep the dead present in healthy ways. Mourning is not a wall of solitude but a shared craft that honors loss while enabling the living to continue. Enoch's guidance helps communities bear sorrow without becoming captive to it, and the tablets provide a framework for remembrance that sustains moral continuity across generations. The epistle also contemplates the paradox of secrecy. Many truths are given to the righteous in ways that are guarded but not hoarded. The tablets teach discretion, explaining that some knowledge is entrusted to those who will steward it without exploiting it. Enoch warns against esotericism that elevates secrecy into superiority. The true guard of secrets is service, the kind that uses privileged insight to aid the vulnerable. This ethical restraint is a hallmark of the righteous character. In the texture of these instructions there is room for humor and human fallibility, a kind of humane realism that prevents sanctimony. Enoch sometimes underscores human absurdity to disarm pretension and to remind readers that moral growth is often messy. The epistle's occasional warmth and wryness make it emotionally accessible, inspiring a humility that welcomes correction with grace. This tone keeps the teaching alive and relatable beyond the austere courtroom of doctrine. Prophecy in these writings is not simply prediction but a moral diagnosis that aims to call people into corrective action. Enoch uses predictive language to motivate change, not to satisfy curiosity about the future. The tablets of fire thus function as a summons to responsibility. If futures can be shaped by present choices, then prophecy becomes an urgent lever for moral agency. Enoch's oracles stir rather than paralyze, freeing listeners to act decisively. There are sections of the epistle that feel like careful diplomacy, as if Enoch writes with an awareness of how fragile communities can be. He crafts language to persuade rather than coerce, reminding leaders that authority must be earned through humility and service. The tablets thus instruct rulers and influencers in the arts of governance that love both truth and mercy, balancing firmness with tenderness. The result is a political ethic that seeks the flourishing of all under fair law. Even the aesthetics of the tablets matter. Enoch's images celebrate beauty as a moral category. The epistle praises artistic acts that uplift the soul and warn against art that glorifies cruelty or self-aggrandizement. Beauty, in this moral calculus, is not escapism but a guidepost toward the good. It shapes desire and models a world ordered by harmony. The righteous are therefore invited to cultivate spaces of beauty that reflect the justice they seek. The narrative returns often to the notion of accountability across time, an intergenerational ledger in which deeds are entered and remembered. The tablets of fire make memory an ethical instrument, keeping both wounds and honors alive in ways that can be redressed or celebrated. Enoch's teachings urge a responsible stewardship of memory so that history does not become a weapon of revenge but a tool of honest reckoning. This careful remembering works to repair communities over time. One of the most compelling lessons of the epistle is the insistence that small acts of virtue accumulate into durable moral structures. The tablets do not grandstand about dramatic conversion, they celebrate the slow accumulation of faithfulness. Enoch's pedagogy values consistency. 1,000 small acts of justice reshape neighborhoods, change markets, and alter destinies. The listener is encouraged to see the moral life as a long patience rather than a string of heroic moments. Skepticism and critique are not ignored. The epistle receives those who doubt with rigorous respect, inviting them into a discipline of testing and practice. Enoch seems to believe that doubt can be a healthy stage in moral formation, a tempering fire that refines belief into trustworthy commitment. The tablets therefore offer a space for questioners, urging them to try the practices, see the effects, and decide based on lived experience rather than unchecked assumption. In its final reaches, the epistle becomes both intimate counsel and civic manifesto, knitting private virtues into public policies and personal habits into political reform. Enoch's tablets form a blueprint for communities that wish to endure with justice and compassion, not by sheer will but by the slow and steady mooring of their practices. To hear this document is to be invited into a lifelong work, to preserve what matters and to remake what has gone wrong with patient, creative fidelity. Throughout the text, imagery of fire continues to guide, its heat a metaphor for both trial and illumination. The tablets of fire do not consume indiscriminately, they reveal and refine. If the righteous accept their glow, they are transformed into people whose lives carry a luminous pattern, clearer speech, more generous hands, and steadier courage in the face of despair. The closing movements of the epistle feel less like an ending and more like a recentering. Enoch does not withdraw from the scene but plants a marker for the ongoing work of living by the tablets. The story he tells is circular rather than terminal. Each generation receives the tablets, interprets them, and then passes them on, altered by time but faithful in aim. This cyclical view invites listeners to see themselves as part of a chain, tasked with keeping the fire alive. If you carry this story with you beyond the hearing, you take with it a sense that moral instruction is at once precise and mysterious, practical and transcendent. Enoch's tablets of fire and the epistle of the righteous are not simply relics of a vanished age, but ongoing challenges to anyone who would live deliberately. The invitation is clear: to enter into a practice of living that honors obligations without losing mercy, that prizes humility without surrendering conviction, and that keeps the fire of justice bright through the long night. Listen as a voice crosses the arid plain of memory and speaks about a time when heaven and earth seemed to bend toward one another, when the ordinary boundaries that hold worlds apart trembled and broke. In that telling, a handful of beings, called Watchers, took it upon themselves to know and to change what was not theirs to change. They descended with curiosity and hunger, bright in the way of stars and reckless in the way of men, and the story of their descent becomes the first breach in a world already fragile. The air itself seems to hold its breath when the narrative turns to the quiet moment before disaster becomes visible, and you can almost imagine the hush of the watching earth as choices were made. Enoch walks across that hush, step by step, a bridge between the human and the cosmic. He is not a warrior or a king, but a man who hears more than most and remembers what others forget. When the Watchers speak and teach, when they offer forbidden knowledge, it is to him that the complaint and the record return, as if the earth needed an ear that could also speak to heaven. The epistle of the righteous, which bears his shape and his words, unfolds as both testimony and warning, a voice raised to comfort the innocent and to indict the guilty. The Watchers were not monstrous at first. They were called to look and to guard. Their name suggests vigilance, a masculine watchfulness assigned to oversee and to learn. But vigilance without restraint can twist into hunger, and what begins as an honorable curiosity turned to transgression when they crossed the luminous threshold between observer and participant. They took wives from among the daughters of men, and their unions birthed giants, beings whose bodies filled the earth and whose appetites emptied it. Names in this story sit like stones in a river: Semyaza, Azazel, and others who agreed together to descend and to stay. Semyaza stands as a leader, a figure who convinces and persuades, and his voice echoes with the temptation of choice offered as liberation. Azazel becomes a different kind of symbol, teaching not only techniques of metal and craft but also revealing cosmetics of deception, the way human pride can be dressed up and called art. Each name, each teaching, becomes a line in the indictment that Enoch carries into the bright courts above. When the Watchers taught, they taught without the consent of those who had ordained them. They introduced the secrets of heaven to hands not made for them, tools and arts that unmoored what was natural. The metals and the weapons they showed to humankind made craftsmen into forgers of death. The cosmetics taught to women were not only ornaments but tools that altered perception, seeds of vanity that fed a cycle of desire and domination. It must be said plainly, the story is not a morality tale about technology alone. It is a drama about the misuse of knowledge, and the lesson hovers over every scene. Knowledge in itself was never condemned. The fault lies in the manner it was used, and the bringing down of things meant to be kept apart. The implications ripple like waves. When boundaries are overstepped, communities that depend on those boundaries begin to falter. From the birth of the giants came lawlessness of a particular kind. The Nephilim, as they were later called, consumed provisions and trampled the tender growths of the earth. Their size did not only enlarge their bodies, it amplified their appetites and their arrogance. Villages were terrorized, fields despoiled, and the fragile trust between neighbor and neighbor frayed into fear. Enoch's account grows ever more urgent as the consequences unfold. He writes of the cries of women, he listens to the lament of the earth itself. There is a sense of mourning in the pages that is not sentimental but elemental, soil and water and seed, all groaning under the weight of excess. He is witness to the slow corruption of creation, an observer who becomes the instrument of a higher tribunal. This tribunal will not be imagined in human terms alone. Enoch turns his face upward and narrates a courtroom in the heights, where angels and the Most High convene to pass judgment on the deed of the watchers. The scene is juridical yet cosmic. The record is kept on tablets of heaven, and the charges are read aloud with unambiguous clarity. To hear it is to feel a coldness like frost on the skin of the world, a recognition that some actions reverberate beyond the touch of ordinary consequence. The charges themselves, when spoken, are meticulous. The watchers are accused of teaching sorcery and revealing heavenly secrets to the uninitiated, of corrupting the living by their unions, and of filling the earth with violence. These are not trivialities. Each accusation corresponds to an offense against the structure of life. The language of the charge is juridical but also moral. It names harms that are both public and metaphysical. There is a scene of pleading that follows, where the fallen ones try to excuse themselves, where they justify their choices as matters of love or necessity. Enoch renders their pleas in a voice that recognizes human motives, attraction, compassion, a desire to belong. Yet the answer from above is steady, unyielding, making clear that love cannot be an excuse for overturning the order that sustains life. What happens next is punishment and containment. The commanders among the watchers are bound in subterranean places, chained by angelic decree and hidden until the day of final accounting. The earth itself is tasked to hold them, and a darkness is cast over the place of their confinement. These bindings are symbolic as well as literal. They represent the reassertion of limits that must be restored before balance can return. Azazel receives a particular condemnation, to be cast into the desert and bound until judgment, his knowledge and his presence to be silenced because of the damage his teachings inflicted. The narrative focuses on him not just as an individual but as an emblem of cultural transmission gone awry, a cautionary figure about leaders who teach in service of vanity. Semyaza and the other leaders are likewise confined, and the text lingers on the imagery of chains and stone and sealed caverns, things that have weight as well as meaning. Enoch does not stop at recounting crimes and punishments. He becomes a mediator of sorts, relaying verdicts and giving words of instruction to those who remain. He writes the Epistle of the Righteous to fortify the faithful against despair, to explain where justice will touch down and how the purest should live in the interval between fall and restoration. The epistle is pastoral and prophetic, a combination of consolation and stern counsel. Its tone varies between calm reassurance and impatient rebuke. To the righteous, Enoch promises vindication. To the wicked, he pronounces sorrow. Yet his is not a simple dichotomy of reward and punishment. The epistle explores the ways in which righteousness is lived day by day, in conduct, in mercy, in attention to the needs of the weak. It resists simplistic moralism by insisting that righteousness issues in specific acts in the world. Enoch's voice in these writings often returns to the imagery of light. He speaks of days when light will shine in a way unknown before, of luminous paths for those who endure. This light is not merely metaphoric, it is described as a certainty of future rightness, a time when all wrongs will be known and weighed. The promise acts as a counterweight to the darkness that had descended under the rule of the giants. The epistle also explores the theme of time. Enoch pays attention to seasons and epochs as if they were breaths in the lungs of the world. There is a timetable for judgment, a sequence that moves from immediate containment of wrongdoers to a final reckoning where the record of each life will be opened. For those listening, the effect is to situate present suffering within a larger arc, to make endurance intelligible. As the narrative unfolds further, Enoch recounts the cry of the mountains and the testimony of the trees, as if the whole created order could be called upon to witness the crimes. He listens to the rivers, which carry both sustenance and witness, and he knows the stars do not simply watch but remember. Such imagery deepens the sense that the whole cosmos cares about justice. It is a moral geography where land and water and sky are participants. The flood, which many recall as a separate tale, is woven into this same fabric as consequence and cure. Here it is presented not as arbitrary wrath, but as cleansing action that removes the tangible results of corruption. Rain falls in torrents, vast and unavoidable, and the old architecture of sin is dissolved beneath it. Yet the flood also reveals the tenderness of survival. There is care enough for a remnant, people and seeds both protected and chosen for a future that must be rebuilt. The epistle addresses the survivors with specific counsel. Enoch counsels them to hold fast to memory, to teach their children the story as an armor, not a curse. He instructs on the stewardship of the earth, on the ways in which tending to the soil and to neighbors is itself a form of liturgy. The surviving communities are called to reorder life according to justice, to make what the watchers broke into a ground for new fidelity. In many moments, the language of prophecy becomes intensely personal. Enoch predicts the emergence of leaders and false prophets, of seasons of persecution and of secret consolations. He writes about trials in ways that sound like interviews with future griefs, naming the precise temptations that will come to those who are called righteous. This foreknowledge provides a pattern: temptation, failure, repentance, restoration, and ultimately vindication. The epistle does not shy away from describing the afterlife in concrete terms. It speaks of abodes of light for the righteous and prisons of darkness for the transgressors, of systems of reward and consequence that conclude earthly stories with fitting ends. These scenes are painted not to terrify but to orient. They help readers and listeners to know that actions ripple beyond immediate sight. Enoch's images make the moral arithmetic of the cosmos feel comprehensible, even humanly measured. Yet the narrative returns again and again to the idea of mediation. Enoch is a mediator between pronouncement and practice, a writer whose letter instructs how to comport oneself in the face of cosmic judgment. His role echoes ancient figures who stand between law and people, priests who hold up the rubric of right action so communities can measure themselves. The epistle thus functions as catechesis, theology made practical in the form of counsel and exhortation. Enoch's path into the heavens is staggered with encounters that read like a guidebook of the cosmos. He passes through 7 heavens, each layer revealing different orders and functions. In each layer he listens and learns, and the things he records are at once astronomical and moral. The heavens are described not as abstract spaces but as populated regions with bureaucracies and dynamics, places where counsel is given, judgments are issued, and fate is shaped. Those heavenly courts do not operate like earthly courts, yet they share a sense of deliberation and witness. There is debate, there is the weighing of testimony, and there is a fidelity to the book in which all deeds are entered. Enoch records the existence of tablets that never lie, writings that keep the precise account of human words and deeds. The notion of a celestial ledger comforts the faithful who long for fairness and unnerves those who rely on secrecy. The theme of secret knowledge recurs as a temptation that can be either noble or ruinous. Some secrets conduce to healing and art, others to domination and chaos. Enoch paints these distinctions with care, refusing to demonize knowledge itself while insisting on the responsibility that accompanies any revelation. It is a meditation on ethics: to whom does knowledge belong, and what does one owe when given what can alter the fate of many? Among the teachings of the Watchers that Enoch describes are skills that render human life more efficient and more dangerous, metalworking that allowed swords and armor, metallurgy that unveiled weaponry and craft, enchantments that altered appearance and persuasion. They reveal how technical expertise, when untethered from just aims, can heighten human destructiveness as much as human flourishing. Enoch is careful to show the ambivalence. The same craft could heal or harm, depending on the hands that employ it. The epistle takes a long, tender look at sorrow. Enoch hears mothers weeping over the loss of their children, sees cities emptied by violence, registers the minute ways populations reshape themselves to avoid hunger. The text does not sentimentalize grief, but leans into its reality, respectful and raw. It becomes a companion for those who carry wounds, offering a theology of lament that permits both anger and prayer. Hope, for Enoch, is not naive. It is a disciplined expectation of future rightness that shapes present behavior. He urges the faithful to act as if the final judgment were already in effect, to compact their days around deeds that will be recognized when the cosmic ledger is opened. This ethic of anticipation alters daily choice. What one does in secret becomes practice for a future public reckoning. There are also passages where the narrative becomes lyrical about creation itself. Enoch lingers on the music of waters and the ordered courses of the stars, on trees that bear fruit at appointed times, and on beasts that follow their own patterns. The wonder in these descriptions anchors his moral teaching. If creation is good and intentional, then violations upon it are not merely social wrongs but affronts to design. The aesthetic sensibility infuses the moral argument with reverence. The epistle constructs a cosmos that is moral at every level. Animals obey laws, the stars keep appointed stations, and even the inanimate has a testimony to give. The moral universe described is not punitive for its own sake but self-regulating, and fractions create dissonance that threatens the harmony of the whole. Enoch's remedy is both practical and spiritual, calling for personal fidelity to restore communal order. In its pastoral moments, the letter grows tender with instruction on how to live with others. It speaks against exploitation and for the fair treatment of the poor and the orphaned. Enoch insists that humility is the mark of those who will stand in judgment and that pride, the very sin the watchers embodied, will be the grounds of ruination. These instructions situate social justice at the heart of spiritual integrity. The epistle's prophetic voice also addresses cosmic timelines beyond the flood. Enoch writes of seasons yet to come, the rise of unjust kings, the betrayal of communities by their leaders, the deceit sown by those who would profit from chaos. He warns his readers to be vigilant and to choose leaders who reflect the ethos of accountability and compassion. The future is thus not an inevitability of despair but a field of human responsibility. At times the writing turns to law as a motif, as if Enoch imagines the cosmos as a legal order with statutes and precedents. He recounts the names of sins with the precision of a prosecutor and yet tempers this with appeals to repentance. The interplay of law and mercy becomes a central theological tension, the necessity of order balanced with the possibility of restoration. Enoch records scenes of angels in attendance, not merely as decor but as actors who maintain the governance of things. Some angels fulfill roles of guardianship and aid, while others become judges and recorders. The multiplicity of angelic functions suggests the complexity of cosmic administration. It is not a single voice but a chorus, a community of beings each with tasks. Their presence reassures that failure is not unobserved and that correction can be enacted beyond human means. The narrative also explores the psychology of wrongdoing. Enoch speculates sympathetically about temptation, how novelty appeals, how power intoxicates, how loneliness leads to alliances built on reckless promises. This humanization does not excuse the watchers but offers insight into the pathways by which good intention bends into breach. Understanding these pathways is part of Enoch's pastoral work, equipping the righteous to resist similar lures. There are passages where the epistle reads like a memoir of awe. Enoch describes luminous visions and the sense of being small before a vast moral order. He admits to trembling at times, not because of fear of punishment but out of the enormity of responsibility to speak for truth. The humility of such first-person confessions lends credibility to his admonitions. He is not a distant theoretician but a participant in the moral drama. The story of the Watchers is told not to estrange the listener from those beings, but to show how beings of light can fall when they mistake their gifts for ownership. Enoch's narrative suggests that angelic or human power without accountability becomes ruinous. The tragedy is not just that the Watchers erred, it is that their errors created ripples that harmed innocent lives. Enoch's epistle continually returns to the welfare of the innocent and the weak, which is its moral axis. He tells of infants who died, of women bereft of husbands, of elderly people left to fend for themselves. The righteous are called to be guardians of these vulnerable people, to repair the breaches that human pride has created. This imperative grounds his theology in ordinary compassion. In the telling, justice is not simply punitive, it is restorative, aiming to heal what was harmed and to reestablish balance. The chains and binding that befall the Watchers are necessary to prevent further harm, but the ultimate horizon is restoration of right relations, not merely revenge. Enoch wants his readers to see that punishment and healing work together in the economy of a just cosmos. The epistle sometimes reads like a letter to future generations, as if Enoch imagines listeners far removed from his immediate catastrophe who would nevertheless need instruction for similar contingencies. He writes with fondness and ferocity toward posterity, wanting to hand on both the grief and the hope. His voice becomes prophetic in the temporal sense, a bridge across centuries that keeps wisdom intact. Ethics in this narrative is inseparable from memory. Enoch implores the righteous to remember rightly, to keep the names and deeds of the past vividly before them so those mistakes are not repeated. Memory operates as a communal immune system. When people remember, the same temptations can be recognized and resisted. To forget, in Enoch's theology, is to invite relapse into earlier sins. There is a sustained emphasis on speech and silence. The Watchers spoke in ways that seduced and misguided, and Enoch counsels the righteous on when to speak and when to hold silence. Words have force in this world, they can bind or loose. Therefore, prudence in speech becomes a spiritual discipline, a means of cultivating communities that do not fall prey to demagogues. More than once the epistle returns to the figure of the judge in the courtroom, an image that recurs because human institutions need imagery that confers order. The cosmic judiciary is both terrifying and consoling, terrifying for its finality, consoling for its fairness. Enoch trusts that the ultimate sifting will not be arbitrary and that those who are faithful will be vindicated. There are also passages of uncanny beauty where Enoch betrays his poetic sensibility. He writes of the dawn as if it were a sacrament, of the moon's soft rule as a kind of mercy, and of stars that keep counsel with one another. This lyrical quality softens the sternness of legal language and reminds the reader that spiritual life involves joy as well as discipline. The cosmos is not only a courtroom but a sanctuary. The text carefully avoids portraying God as capricious. The divine will in Enoch's epistle is consistent. It seeks restoration, order, and the flourishing of creation. When wrath is described, it is framed as a response to persistent injustice rather than an arbitrary outburst. This portrayal gives shape to a theology where love and justice exist in dynamic, sometimes painful, tension. In the epistle, time is redeemed by promise. The future is not chaos but ordained. Enoch sees a day when the dead will rise, when the records will be opened, and when the rightful order will be evident to all. That eschatological hope is more than metaphysical speculation. It functions here as a moral spur, motivating present action in behalf of a promised world. Enoch's writing is often directed to communities living in exile from their best self, people who have lost confidence in ordinary institutions because of greed and violence. He writes to restore trust where it has been broken, to teach practices of communal repair, shared labor, equitable distributions, and the elevation of wisdom above ambition. His instructions are detailed and mundane. They concern how to steward fields, care for orphans, and adjudicate disputes with fairness. This attentiveness to the ordinary is one of the epistle's strengths. Enoch refuses to reduce spiritual life to abstract belief and insists that ethics must concretely transform daily arrangements. He examines market dealings and household relations, and he insists that holiness is visible in how bread is shared. The microcosm of daily decisions becomes the training ground for enduring righteousness. As the narrative continues, it invites listeners to imagine themselves as part of the continuum. The epistle invites engagement rather than passive admiration. It asks, how do you live in a world where cosmic categories matter? How do you act when the past haunts the present and the future promises justice? These rhetorical questions are not pedantic, they are an open hand extended toward practical self-examination. There are, too, vivid scenes of heavenly instruments, harps, scrolls, and scroll cases, symbols of remembrance and order. Enoch describes scribes recording deeds on a scale that dwarfs human memory, a divine archive that preserves the truth even when human recollection falters. The imagery emphasizes that injustice cannot remain hidden forever. There will be a day when everything is known and accounted for. Often the epistle returns to the motif of ascent and descent. The watchers descended and were punished. Enoch ascends to receive revelation and descends to deliver it. These motions shape the moral architecture of the text. Ascent corresponds to seeing, descent to responsibility, and the two together create a cycle that binds revelation to ethics. Enoch embodies this cycle. He sees and therefore must act. The text also offers an anthropology of the human soul. Enoch suggests that humans carry a spark of divine image yet are vulnerable to temptation. That dual nature is the stage upon which the drama unfolds, nobility and fallibility together. The epistle's moral work is to cultivate the noble capacities and to guard against those impulses that erode them. At times, the narrative addresses sin with surgical clarity, naming specific acts that corrupt communities, lying, taking bribes, oppressing the poor, and failing to provide for the widow and orphan. But rather than resorting to mere denunciation, Enoch insists on repair and restitution. The righteousness he prescribes is pragmatic. It is sorrow turned into action. This emphasis on restitution is part of a broader economy in which wrongdoing demands repair not only because of law but because of relationship. Enoch recognizes that the fabric of community is woven of trust and that reparations help to mend that fabric. Thus, atonement is relational rather than merely doctrinal. It restores broken webs of human fellowship. The pastoral tone often surfaces in private exhortations to prayer and fasting. Enoch counsels the righteous to cultivate spiritual disciplines that shape the heart toward compassion and endurance. Prayer is not an abstract ritual but a form of attentiveness to the needs of others. Fasting is not self-abasement but a practice that cultivates empathy with the suffering. The spiritual life becomes a training regimen for moral clarity. Enoch also anticipates future conflicts between different religious visions. He warns about those who will speak falsehoods in the name of revelation and teaches discernment as a spiritual skill. This warning is not merely combative, it is protective. Enoch wants communities to hang on to truth with the steady hands of a caregiver safeguarding a child. The voice of the epistle remains insistently practical. It returns to how communities mark time with feasts and fasts, how they teach children names that matter, and how they cultivate leaders who are accountable. Ritual is not presented as empty ceremony but as an incarnational way to embody values. The religious life, in Enoch's telling, is inseparable from civic responsibility. There is an undercurrent of hope about justice for the oppressed that sustains much of the letter. Enoch promises that those who have suffered under the tyranny of giants and corrupt leaders will not be forgotten. He speaks of scales that will one day balance and of reconstructions that will heal. This hope functions as a pole that holds up the community's courage in times of tribulation. Throughout, Enoch is attentive to the small and the large. He writes of seeds and of stars, of village markets and of cosmic courts. This breadth gives the epistle a rare quality. It refuses to compartmentalize life into sacred and secular, but insists they belong together. The moral vision is thus expansive, offering a theology that touches every part of daily existence. As the narrative nears its concluding arc, it speaks insistently about endurance. The righteous are called to perseverance, not to the brittle patience of passivity, but to the active persistence of service. Endurance becomes a virtue because it sustains the labor of repair across decades and generations. Enoch's counsel is essentially vocational. Do not be distracted from the work of tending the world. The epistle concludes with a final promise that folds back into the tale of the watchers. Those who have fallen will be judged thoroughly, and those who endured will be vindicated fully. The closing words are not merely apocalyptic fanfare, but a sober assurance that justice will be done and that the created order will be restored. This assurance gives meaning to every injunction and every lament voiced earlier in the text. If you are listening now, perhaps in the flow of daily life, the story invites you to carry its images as moral instruments. The Watcher's fall becomes more than antiquarian lore, it becomes a mirror for present temptations. The epistle of the righteous is less a relic than a manual for attentive living, a call to protect the vulnerable, to steward knowledge responsibly, and to remember that every action contributes to the world's harmony. Imagine living in a community shaped by Enoch's counsel, fields cared for by cooperative hands, leaders chosen for wisdom rather than cunning, elders recounting the story of the fall as both grief and instruction. The air would hold a different kind of stillness, not the numb hush of fear, but the attentive quiet of people who know their actions matter. These practices, small and repeated, would act as inoculations against the larger corruptions that once threatened the earth. Finally, the narrative invites you to consider your own watchfulness. Who are the watchers in your life, voices that teach you to misuse power or to praise things that hollow you out? And who are the righteous ones, ordinary people who feed others, who bind wounds, who teach their children to speak truth? The epistle of the righteous offers its counsel across centuries: remember, care, repair, and live in such a way that when the ledger is opened, your deeds will stand in the light without shame. There is a quiet way to begin this story, a hush like the pause before a bell. Imagine a man who walks out of the common world and into a vision, not because he seeks escape, but because the world itself becomes a doorway. His name is Enoch, and the place he enters is not a land but a covenant of light, a promise that bends time and speech into a single testimony. Listening to him is like listening to a river describe its own path, soft at first, then inexorable and sure. Enoch's testimony unfolds as if told by someone who has seen both the clockwork of the heavens and the small, trembling habits of human beings. He speaks to a handful, to a generation, and to those yet unborn. His tone is both intimate and judicial, a blend of fatherly counsel and prophetic charge. What he leaves behind, known in later traditions as the Epistle of the Righteous, threads moral urgency into celestial revelation. The covenant of light that Enoch proclaims is offered in the language of selection and responsibility. To be chosen is not to be exempt from sorrow or labor, but to be entrusted with a luminous duty. Candidates for that trust are taught to live attentively, to measure actions by a standard that reflects the order seen in the skies. Every small decision, in his view, participates in the wider architecture of justice and mercy. Enoch introduces this covenant through scenes of instruction and witness. He describes steps taken across thresholds of understanding, of punishment, and of mercy. Angels accompany him as interpreters rather than tyrants. They explain the machinery of fate without removing human agency. Enoch learns to speak of law in terms that feel like warmth and also like a sword. A covenant heals when kept but chastens when broken. There is an early image Enoch returns to, a lamp hung up in a dark house. The lamp is not spectacle but guide. It does not force people to gather around it. Instead, its light reveals paths. In his testament, that lamp becomes the emblem of knowledge that is alive, not dead doctrine. The chosen are those who tend the lamp and carry its small radiance into rooms where fear has grown thick. Transitioning from metaphor to mandate, Enoch insists the covenant has ethical contours. The chosen are to practice justice in the market and kindness in the home. There is a discipline to speech. Jokes and complaints are not trivial, for words shape the soul. The epistle teaches that speech can contaminate a people as surely as disease can a body, and that stewards of the light must guard their tongues as if keeping a key. Enoch's document pulses with urgency because he beholds an impending judgment that is both public and personal. He narrates scenes of the heavens opening and of trials measured out in proportional justice. Yet his judgment is not merely punitive, it is corrective, a reordering rather than annihilation. The covenant of light sets a path back to wholeness by naming the fractures that must be healed. He paints the cosmos in terms of relational architecture. Stars and seasons are not mere backdrop but participants in a moral economy. Their courses serve as exemplars of steadiness and measure. In describing them, Enoch seeks to make the invisible visible, to show how human fidelity can echo cosmic rhythm and how human corruption can disturb it. The narrative moves naturally from cosmic imagery to the company of watchers, beings who once crossed their bounds. These watchers are not monsters in a simple sense, but cautionary figures. They reveal the peril of desire untethered to wisdom. Enoch's recounting of their fall is precise and mournful, as if he has watched a tower crumble because its builders sank into vanity. From the fall of the watchers, Enoch draws practical lessons for the chosen community. Temptations are not abstract, they come in seductive tutorials and promises of quick esteem. Enoch warns that barter with pride or illicit knowledge fractures the covenant of care. Thus the epistle calls for vigilance in the face of acclaim, lest fame become a substitute for fidelity. Enoch's voice softens when he speaks of children and the weak. He imagines a household where the covenant is learned through small acts, feeding the hungry, setting rights where they have been denied, teaching the young to keep their hands from harm. His tenderness is not sentimental, it is strategic, because the future of the covenant depends on ordinary, repeated kindness. He frames piety as practical and communal rather than solitary and sensational. Throughout the Testament, the covenant of light is both an internal law and a social contract. Enoch shows how inward transformation reshapes public life. Seeds of honesty planted in private dealings bloom as trust among neighbors. The community he envisions is one where sacrament and justice are braided, where rights without righteousness become hollow gestures. Enoch's discourse is saturated with images of pathways and gates, thresholds and guardians. These images help him translate celestial mechanics into ethical demands. He likens patience to gatekeeping and repentance to retracing one's steps at dawn. In this way, his language anchors the extraordinary in everyday practice, making lofty ideas usable for daily living. Interwoven with advice are stories of deliverance, moments when the covenant clothes a person in protection. Enoch recounts cases where fear is lifted, debts forgiven, and courts rendered righteous. These narrations are not miracles presented as spectacles, they are outcomes of right action. The covenant, when honored, recalibrates life to match the intention of the light, to repair what was broken and to shelter the vulnerable. In the middle passages, Enoch turns to prophecy, predicting cycles of rise and decline. Yet his prophecies are tempered by invitations. Real change is possible because the covenant can be renewed. He traces epochs like changes of weather, and he urges preparedness rather than panic. For Enoch, seeing the end is not an end in itself, seeing is a summons to growth. He often pauses to address the conscience of listeners directly. Choose, he seems to say, between quick pleasure and lasting peace. This directness gives the epistle a rhetorical pace that alternates between gentle reasoning and pointed exhortation. You can feel the text balancing compassion with discipline, as a teacher might when guiding an anxious pupil toward steadiness. A striking theme in Enoch's testament is communal memory. He cherishes stories as repositories of covenantal truth. Recounted dynasties and ancestral examples function as both warning and encouragement. To remember rightly, he insists, is to carry the covenant forward. Forgetting is the first step toward betrayal. Enoch's cosmology introduces angels who preserve the covenantal record. These watchers are not merely observers but curators of the moral ledger. They collect testimonies of actions and motives and present them when judgment is called. It is an image that underscores accountability without invoking voyeuristic fear. The world has keepers who attend to the fidelity of human souls. The covenant of light also embraces a kind of jurisprudence, a careful weighing of acts and their consequences. Enoch imagines a courtroom of the heavens where mercy and justice converse. This duality reassures the devoted that justice is not the opposite of compassion, but its necessary framework. Laws serve to clarify love rather than replace it. A recurring device in his voice is the contrast between the visible and the invisible. He insists that what we see with our eyes is often a shadow of a deeper reality. Our moral choices are the hidden scaffolding that sustains social life. The covenant of light invites listeners to orient toward that deeper reality so their acts align with it, even when appearances tempt them otherwise. Enoch's language frequently returns to the motif of light as knowledge and presence. Light exposes, and it warms. Both functions are moral. When Enoch speaks of light touching a life, he means illumination that dispels deceit and warmth that fosters courage. The covenantal metaphor insists that true knowledge is not accumulation of facts but the adoption of luminous moral sight. He recounts scenes in which the righteous are tried by deprivation, not merely by external threat. Fasts, exiles, and tests of faith are described as necessary purgations. These hardships refine character and reveal whether one cherishes the covenant for its comforts or for its truth. Enoch never glamorizes suffering, but he refuses to waste it. Trials, properly borne, become proof of fidelity. There is a notable pastoral strain in his instructions. He speaks as one who tends to a flock, correcting without crushing and urging without coarseness. Enoch's treatment of the weak, the erring, and the fearful is methodical. He prescribes counsel, reparation, and reintegration. The covenant seeks restoration rather than exclusion, provided that those restored accept its demands. At the heart of the epistle lies a promise of immortality of influence, rather than necessarily of physical survival alone. Enoch writes as if the covenant ensures a kind of honor that outlasts decay. Names stay with stories, and stories shape futures. The chosen are encouraged to act so that their deeds continue to instruct and shelter those who follow. Enoch gives attention to lawlessness as a social disease, not merely moral failure. He describes how selfish calculation spreads like rot through institutions, corrupting courts, markets, and families. To combat this, the covenant demands transparency, fair measure, and compassionate rule. Enoch's view of governance is therefore ethical before it is administrative. Rulers must be first moral leaders. Relating the roles of leaders, Enoch advises a balance of strength and compassion. Authority, he argues, should not be an excuse for dominance but a tool for protection. Leaders are entrusted with the welfare of the weak and the upholding of truth, and their legitimacy rests on this stewardship. When power becomes spectacle, the covenant is betrayed and the community unravels. The epistle also touches on intimate interior reforms, habits of prayer, rhythms of reflection, and the cultivation of silence. Enoch insists that the covenant of light needs inner space to grow. Quiet is not avoidance but attention. It is where conscience learns to hear and where resolve is tempered. Practices of inward discipline are offered as means to sustain outward integrity. Enoch's testimony includes a compassionate taxonomy of sins, distinguishing between ignorance and willful depravity. His tone is impatient with deliberate cruelty but patient with ignorance that can be healed by instruction. That careful distinction forms part of his pastoral method. Treatable faults are cured by education and love, while hardened malice calls for firm correction. He tells of a time when communities failed to honor the covenant and disasters followed, not as random acts but as moral consequences. Floods, famines, and wars enter the narrative as parables of ethical collapse. They serve as a lesson that nature, society, and human conscience are entwined. Neglecting one strand strains the whole web. The covenant of light, therefore, becomes the thread by which a society holds together. Enoch uses familial language to bind his audience. He calls his listeners brothers and sisters even when admonishing them sternly. This technique softens rebuke while underscoring mutual accountability. Family terms suggest an intimacy that obliges care. To betray the covenant is to wound kin, and to repair the covenant is to heal the household. At moments, Enoch's imagery turns sharply apocalyptic, but even then his voice is pastoral. He describes endings not only as terror but as transformations. The dissolution of one order ushers a new clarity for those who have kept the light. Apocalypse is presented as revelation rather than only ruin, a final unveiling that rewards sustained faithfulness. Enoch's testament is also liturgical in places, offering prayers and benedictions for those who maintain the covenant. These prayers are not ornate rituals but straightforward petitions for guidance and perseverance. They function like oaths, binding speaker and listener to a shared moral horizon. The liturgical passages act as pauses to renew commitment amid instruction. Another theme is witness. Those who keep the covenant bear testimony that shapes the future. Enoch instructs that faithful living is itself a prophetic act. The stories of the righteous teach by a living example, not only by preached precept. This element of witness makes the covenant of light contagious, but only in the sanest sense, through integrity rather than coercion. Enoch considers repentance the hinge of divine mercy. He writes at length about the act of returning, how it requires humility, restitution, and renunciation of old delights that harmed others. Repentance is not mere sorrow but reparative work. When someone repents, he says, the community must receive them back with structures that prevent a relapse into harm. He gives practical advice about restitution and reconciliation, not as abstract commandments but as methods to rebuild trust. Those who wrong others are instructed to make amends proportionate to damage, and communities are taught how to reintegrate offenders. The covenant of light insists that justice must restore relationships to health, rather than merely punishing bodies. Enoch's narrative habitually links obedience to visibility of hope. He tends to illustrate his points with scenes where small faithful acts produce visible signs: a child's laughter after reconciliation, a field yielding crops after fair stewardship, a disputed boundary settled by honest measure. These concrete images make his teaching plausible and daily. In philosophic contours, Enoch privileges moral intentionality over ritual precision. He is skeptical of practices that become mechanical and empty. The epistle instructs that rituals must point toward transformation, or else they are worthless. For Enoch, the heart's orientation determines the value of ceremony. Ceremony without heart is an inert object. He also contemplates the fate of those who harden against the covenant. Enoch paints their end with sober realism, portraying isolation, confusion, and loss of meaning. These are not melodramatic punishments so much as natural consequences of a life severed from communal trust. The image is bleak but proportional, a tragic portrait rather than vindictive glee. The text includes prophecies about future teachers and leaders who will either honor or betray the covenant. Enoch encourages discernment, urging the chosen to test teachings by their fruits. Charisma without moral fruit is warned against. Conformity to the light is the measure. This counsel becomes a thread for sustaining healthy communities across generations. Enoch is concerned with the transmission of teachings. He prescribes how the covenant must be taught to children and recorded for posterity. Memory practices, concise formulas, and communal recitations are presented as technologies for fidelity. He understands that teachings can fray if neglected, so he offers methods to bind the covenant firmly into common life. The epistle occasionally ventures into cosmic legalities, explaining rewards and punishments in terms that connect behavior to cosmic order. Enoch frames these as natural law rather than arbitrary decree. Right action aligns someone with the way of the world, wrong action sets them at odds with the pattern that sustains life. This framing serves to moralize reality without devolving into simple fear tactics. Enoch shows a surprising attention to economics and responsibility toward the poor. He insists that wealth is a trust to be stewarded rather than hoarded. Generosity is not framed merely as virtue but as covenantal duty that maintains social equilibrium. The covenant of light binds prosperity to generosity and condemns laxity in the face of need. The epistle also offers warnings about legalism. Enoch fears that overemphasis on rules can choke compassion. Thus he argues for a balance. Law without love becomes harsh, and love without law becomes careless. The covenant he articulates is thus a dynamic balance of norms and grace that must be maintained carefully and continually. Enoch narrates instances where foreigners are included, showing the covenant's reach beyond tribal lines. Hospitality, he suggests, is a test of fidelity to the light. Welcoming others, even when they are different, is a practice that stretches empathy and dissolves fear. The covenant of light thus forms a bridge toward more expansive belonging. The Testament pays careful attention to inner motives, urging people to interrogate their desires honestly. Enoch suggests exercises of self-examination, daily reckonings where one notes acts of love and of harm. These small practices are meant to cultivate moral muscles that grow stronger with repetition. He imagines conscience as a garden that needs steady tending. There is a strain of hope that runs like a river beneath Enoch's warnings. The future can be mended. This hope is not ungrounded optimism but a robust expectation rooted in covenantal promises. Enoch insists that if the chosen persist in the light, their descendants will inherit a cleaner world. It is a hope with practical scaffolding, education, fair law, and shared ritual. Enoch's language often returns to the theme of companions who will stand with the faithful at the last day. These companions are not merely angels but the community of the righteous. Their solidarity is portrayed as both protection and testimony. In standing together they render their covenant evident. Alone, the test is far harder. The epistle addresses grief with a tenderness unusual for its age. Enoch acknowledges pain as a teacher, not merely a curse. He recognizes the messy human experience of loss and offers rituals for mourning and remembering. Grief, when held within covenantal community, becomes a site of transformation rather than a pit of despair. Enoch ends many of his pericopes with benedictory images: bread shared, doors opened, fields replanted. These images provide the listener with tangible end notes that translate cosmic promises into earthly scenes. The covenant is thus never abstract, it is enacted around tables and in the mending of fences. That practical orientation keeps the narrative grounded. He also addresses the fear of death with philosophical lucidity. Enoch neither trivializes mortality nor clings to it. He frames death as a passage that reveals the truth of a life lived in light. The covenant's promise extends beyond the grave in the sense that the good one has done continues to shape the living. Acts of love endure as moral legacies. Across the epistle runs a call to education as moral defense. Enoch wants the chosen to be taught how to read signs, interpret dreams, and recognize manipulative speech. Education is described as armor and compass, helping communities navigate storms. The aim is not cleverness but wisdom, the skill of aligning judgment with the light. He sometimes addresses rulers directly, offering counsel on policy and law that is fundamentally ethical. He persuades them that stable rule grows from justice, measured taxation, and care for the vulnerable. The covenant of light provides a blueprint for governance that prizes the commonweal over short-term power. Rulers who follow it preserve the fabric of society. Enoch's testament is also attentive to art and speech. He values truthful song and lament, and he condemns songs that flatter the corrupt. Art is a form of remembering and a vehicle of moral formation. When beauty imitates goodness, it teaches. When it masks cruelty, it deceives. Thus art, like law, has moral responsibility. As his work moves toward conclusion, Enoch reiterates themes as if polishing a jewel's facets. He returns to light, to guardianship, to the urgency of small acts. The repetition is not redundancy but catechesis. It secures the covenant in memory and will. Like a teacher repeating a crucial lesson, he ensures the main points are embodied before the hearing fades. Enoch closes with a simple covenantal formula that summons the listener to an ongoing practice. It is both invitation and command: keep the lamp, tend the poor, speak truth, repair harm, and love as you have been loved. The finality of his words is not end but entrustment, passing the torch across restless generations. The covenant of light thus remains a living vow, renewing itself in each act of fidelity. There are stories that seem to arrive already ancient, as if they remember the shape of the world before we did. The tale of Enoch sits in that company, a figure who walked with God and was no more, a man who ascended into the mystery and left behind words that continued to move through generations. The Epistle of the Righteous is one of those words, an eternal letter folded into the scriptures of longing and of judgment, a message that travels like a river through sedimentary layers of faith and fear. Listening to it, even now, feels like reading a sealed map whose lines rearrange themselves to show the contour of our own lives. To understand the epistle, we must begin with Enoch himself, not as a static monument but as a living voice. He is introduced briefly in genealogies and then disappears in a single arresting sentence: he walked with God, then he was no longer here. That absence became presence, a kind of afterlife of influence where sayings and visions proliferated under his name. The epistle attributed to him holds this paradox: written by someone taken from the world, it continues to instruct the world as if the writer were still present. The epistle's form is simple yet profound, a letter written to the righteous and to those who fear the judgment. It reads like a father speaking late into the night, making clear the line between what endures and what dissolves. Yet as a document it also functions like a mirror, urging readers to examine how their own lives measure up against eternity. The tone is at once stern and tender, a voice that warns not out of hatred but out of a fierce desire for the survival of what is good. Its language is wrapped in images of light and darkness, of paths and courts, of books and names being called. Enoch's letter insists on the permanence of names written in heaven and the transient nature of wealth and power. In doing so, it creates a cosmology where ethics and ontology are intertwined. To be righteous is to secure one's place in a structure that is both legal and cosmic. The conviction that moral life has metaphysical consequences gives the epistle its urgency. Over centuries, scholars and faithful readers have tried to fix the epistle into a neat timeline, to pin its authorship and date like a specimen under glass. Yet that kind of certainty proves elusive. Fragments of the letter appear in different collections and manuscript traditions, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to later Christian codices, with variations that reveal a living text adapting to new circumstances. Each variant is a witness to the epistle's power to be refashioned by communities that needed its counsel. The epistle's early readers encountered it in times of social strain and religious upheaval. For a community aware of cosmic watchers and angelic accusations, the letter offered reassurance and a legal defense. Enoch's voice promised that the righteous would not be forgotten, that their deeds were recorded in a ledger beyond corrupt judges. That promise carried not only consolation but a call to steadfastness, a demand that the faithful remain unshaken by the surrounding rot. Language in the epistle often moves in double registers. Ordinary ethical injunctions are also cosmic decrees. To feed the hungry, for example, is not merely charity but a defense of a universal order. The epistle transforms ordinary virtues into participation in divine governance, so that small acts become contributions to the stability of heaven itself. Listening to this now, one hears the amplification that religion can provide, where small human gestures are answered in celestial chambers. Because the letter speaks across ages, it had to be portable in its terms. It uses narrative shortcuts, brief parables, lists of names, mentions of prior judgment scenes, to establish authority without exhaustive argument. Those shortcuts make it easy to remember and to recite, and thus to fit into liturgies and private devotion. Its mimetic power explains why fragments traveled widely and why, in many settings, scribes treated it as an authentic relic of Enoch's hand. But authenticity in antiquity is a different currency than it is for modern historians. Texts were judged by usefulness as much as by pedigree. The Epistle of the Righteous carried the weight of theological usefulness. It articulated a framework where justice could be believed without immediate evidence. That usefulness encouraged communities to preserve and adapt its lines, to make it speak to local enemies and to particular anxieties about the end of days. In that way, the epistle is less a fossil and more a living organ of spiritual life. Its presence among the Dead Sea Scrolls makes clear how Jewish sects of the Second Temple period found in it a theological ally. For a group convinced of its own purity and of an imminent eschaton, Enoch's letter validated separatism and patience. It taught that reward was delayed but sure, encouraging the community to maintain its distinct practices in the expectation of vindication. The epistle's rhythms matched the community's need for moral clarity when political fortunes were unstable. As Christian readers later encountered the epistle, they read it through the lens of Christological expectation. The letter's themes of a Son of Man and heavenly judgment resonated with Christian narratives, and Enoch's voice was sometimes taken as a precursor to salvation history. That appropriation complicated the letter's identity, inviting interpretive overlays that emphasized fulfillment in Christ rather than an independent Enochian tradition. The process shows how sacred texts migrate between traditions, being reframed but still carrying their original charge. Across these religious movements, the figure of Enoch itself accumulated interpretations. He was a transgressive visionary who crossed the boundary between human and angelic realms, and he was a moral prototype of absolute obedience. These dual aspects made him a model both for mystical ascent and for legal piety. The epistle thus functions at multiple levels simultaneously, as ethical instruction, liturgical text, apocalyptic vision, and mystical manual. The imagery of books being opened and names being called is especially potent. In the epistle, the righteous are those whose names are written in a book preserved in heaven, and this literary image offers solace and accountability. It suggests that what truly matters is not ephemeral reputation but the record kept by an impartial and divine scribe. The motif of the book elegantly compresses cosmic justice into a human-friendly metaphor, a ledger, a testament, a letter that outlives empires. Enoch's epistle also insists on the importance of memory. It is as much a plea to be remembered as it is a threat to the arrogant who will be forgotten. The rhetorical logic of the letter uses memory as reward and oblivion as punishment, thereby making historical presence contingent upon moral fidelity. For communities whose historical survival was precarious, that promise of memorialization was a balm and a spur. One of the epistle's recurring preoccupations is with angels, particularly the watchers who transgressed and the orders who administer punishment. Angels in the epistle are juridical agents who observe and report, who mediate between divine justice and earthly life. Their presence creates a legal cosmology where celestial bureaucrats keep files and forward cases. Imagining a cosmos run like a court gives the letter a procedural feel that reassures those who fear arbitrary violence on earth. But alongside the angelic bureaucracy is a profound yearning for mercy. Enoch does not merely enumerate infractions and penalties, he also calls for forgiveness and restoration. This balance between justice and mercy makes the letter humane, because it acknowledges human weakness while demanding correction. The interplay of sternness and compassion gives the epistle emotional depth and moral credibility. Its ethical teaching is concrete rather than abstract. The epistle names behaviors: feeding the hungry, protecting widows, rejecting bribes, speaking truth. This concreteness gives moral life a tangible shape that ordinary people can recognize and perform. It is the kind of moral clarity that can be rehearsed daily, integrated into the rhythm of work and family, and thus made to endure beyond theological speculation. Reading the letter aloud in a community setting creates a collective identity. When people hear the same phrases about the righteous and the judgment, they internalize a shared canon of values. The epistle performs social cohesion by chanting a moral grammar that defines insiders and outsiders. That performative effect explains why the letter was useful for sectarian movements seeking to demarcate purity boundaries. At the same time, the letter's apocalyptic vision offers hope amid suffering. Prophecy in the epistle of the righteous is not remote. It promises immediate vindication at the end of days, but also signals a present reality where the righteous walk in light. The promise of a future reversal makes current suffering part of a larger narrative arc. For listeners, such a perspective reframes hardship as temporary and morally instructive. Language in the epistle carries a liturgical warmth. Phrases meant for confession and for exhortation resound with rhythmic repetition that aids memorization. The sound of the letter becomes part of its theology. Repetition and formula create habits that, over time, shape character. The epistle thus functions as a moral technology, using rhythm and language to cultivate resilience. Because it circulates across cultures, the epistle absorbed motifs from surrounding literature. It resonates with wisdom sayings, with prophetic oracles, and with apocalyptic visions, taking elements from each and reweaving them into a coherent tapestry. That syncretic nature is not a sign of impurity but of adaptability, showing how sacred texts evolve through conversation with contemporaries. As such, the epistle becomes a palimpsest of theological voices, each layer adding nuance. One of the most compelling features of the Epistle of the Righteous is its insistence on the moral significance of speech. Words or deeds, oaths and promises have weight in the cosmic ledger. In that view, rumor and slander are not trivial infractions but offenses that affect cosmic justice. The epistle trains speakers to be aware of the force of their utterances, elevating ordinary conversations into ethically significant acts. Where the epistle speaks of judgment, it often does so with courtroom metaphors, seats, judges, accusers, and witnesses. That metaphorical world reflects lived experience in societies where legal disputes shape daily life. By translating divine justice into legal terms, the epistle makes the ineffable seem administrable, accessible to those who have experienced courts and covenants. This translation helps listeners imagine themselves as petitioners before a compassionate yet exacting judge. There is also a pastoral strain to the letter. It addresses the anxieties of the vulnerable and instructs leaders on how to care for their flock. Enoch's tone when addressing the faint-hearted is consoling and instructive, like a counselor who knows both the law and the heart. The pastoral voice softens the harsher aspects of apocalyptic rhetoric, ensuring that the epistle does not become merely a catalogue of doom. Imagining the physical act of writing helps anchor the epistle's authority. Picture Enoch, pen in hand or stylus on wax, composing instructions for descendants he will not see. The image of writing from exile or from the heavens adds to the letter's poignancy. It is as if the world itself needed a permanent testament against forgetfulness. That act of inscription makes the epistle an anchor in a world of shifting loyalties and fortunes. The epistle's cosmic architecture is not static. It anticipates a future reordering where the righteous occupy positions of honor. Yet that future is contingent upon present conduct, creating a moral calculus where decisions matter. The letter thus serves as a motivational system that ties everyday moral choices to cosmic outcomes. For a listener in the middle of a difficult life, such linkage can translate everyday virtue into existential courage. Historians debate the epistle's provenance, and modern scholarship adds layers of context that enrich our understanding. Philological work teases out ancient variants, while literary analysis reveals trope and technique. Yet scholarly debates rarely diminish the text's spiritual force for those who encounter it devotionally. The epistle remains both a subject of academic inquiry and a living document within spiritual practice. Part of the epistle's endurance comes from its openness to reinterpretation. Whether read in the synagogue, the desert, or the early church, its lines were adapted to address current crises. That plasticity allowed it to speak to multiple audiences without losing its core message, that the righteous are known to God and that justice will finally prevail. The letter's elasticity is therefore its survival strategy. The image of Enoch ascending and being transformed provides a narrative hook for mystics seeking union with the divine. Enoch's journey becomes a blueprint for spiritual ascent, a map that invites imitation through prayer and contemplation. The epistle, in turn, supplies the ethical framework necessary for such ascent, insisting that vision without virtue is perilous. Mystical experience is thus anchored to moral transformation, avoiding a spirituality divorced from concrete action. Enoch's ascension also raises questions about human limitation and divine grace. To what extent do visions authorize behavior, and how should communities interpret striking claims of revelation? The epistle offers an implicit answer: revelation is authentic only when it produces righteousness. Prophetic authority is judged by its fruit, and the epistle demands accountability for those who claim heavenly access. That testing prevents spiritual gullibility while maintaining openness to the extraordinary. Over time, poets and artists found in the epistle a language to express longing and fear. Its cosmic courts and celestial books became metaphors for memory and justice in visual and poetic art. The imagery of light and pilgrimage informed church architecture and devotional paintings, while its legal metaphors shaped sermons and moral treatises. The epistle's capacity to inspire aesthetic production shows how theological texts can permeate culture beyond doctrinal boundaries. The letter's ethical core is also political in subtle ways. When communities use the epistle to justify separation, they make a political decision that shapes resource distribution and social relations. At the same time, when it calls for care of the poor and denunciation of oppression, it becomes a critique of unjust structures. Thus, the epistle can function as both a tool of resistance and a rule for internal discipline, depending on who wields it. Because of its juridical tone, the epistle was attractive to leaders needing validation for reforms. A ruler could quote Enoch to legitimize policies aimed at protecting the vulnerable or punishing corrupt officials. But such uses risk instrumentalizing the letter, turning its ethical imperatives into mere political rhetoric. Enoch's distinct voice resists such reduction by continually redirecting attention to personal virtue rather than public show. Language in the epistle often parallels legal documents in its cadence, declarative, precise, and resonant. That cadence gave it immediacy for communities familiar with contracts and covenants, since the letter's words felt like entries in a mutual agreement. Listening to it, one can almost hear the sharpness of legal speech softened by the warmth of pastoral care. This duality allows the epistle to serve both as law and as exhortation. Eschatology in the Epistle of the Righteous is not a single event but a process with stages: revelation, separation, judgment, and restoration. Each stage has its own moral demands and promises. The complexity of this sequence helps listeners plan spiritual lives that anticipate transitions, cultivating patience and resilience. The eschatological arc thus becomes a scaffold for ethical formation. Even as the letter addresses grand cosmic questions, it never loses sight of individuals. Personal names and stories appear to ground the universal claims in human experience. Enoch's writing often addresses the reader directly, creating an intimacy that makes cosmic judgment feel personally relevant. That intimacy ensures that the letter does not remain abstract theology but becomes a companion for someone walking through the small trials of each day. For many readers, the epistle served as a counter-narrative to despair. In times of exile and persecution, the letter's firm confidence in ultimate justice gave people a reason to keep faith. It offered a horizon beyond powerlessness, a way to imagine suffering as a temporary condition within an eternal drama. The letter's hope is therefore not naive but strategic. It sustains action by promising meaning. Enoch's treatment of the wicked is as instructive as his praise of the righteous. He does not merely demonize sinners but explains the social and spiritual dynamics that lead to their downfall. In doing so, the epistle becomes a diagnostic tool, revealing how pride and greed corrode institutions. This diagnostic function makes the text useful for communities seeking to reform themselves from within. Yet the epistle also contains moments of melancholy, as if the writer mourns the stubbornness of humanity even while hoping for redemption. Those laments humanize the letter, making it less of a triumphant proclamation and more of a sorrowful plea. The combination of grief and hope gives the epistle its tragic dignity and moral earnestness. What makes the Epistle of the Righteous appealing to modern readers is its ability to speak across secular divides. Even stripped of doctrinal commitment, its insistence on justice, remembrance, and the ethical significance of speech resonates. Its metaphors, books, and courts remain understandable, and its moral clarity cuts through contemporary cynicism. For those searching for a moral compass in a noisy world, the letter's voice still matters. Scholars often emphasize variance and redaction history, which can seem technical until one remembers that each variation reflects a living community's priorities. Changes in the text show what certain groups found most pressing, whether to emphasize communal purity, eschatological timing, or ethical particulars. Tracking those changes is like tracing a conversation across centuries, where each participant leaves a mark. The conversation reveals both continuity and adaptation. The epistle's legal metaphors also invite us to consider a spiritual epistemology, what it means to know God and to be known by God. The notion of names written in heaven presupposes personhood recognized by the divine. This reciprocity of recognition forms the ethical backbone of the letter, To act rightly is to be acknowledged is to act rightly. The loop creates a moral identity grounded in mutual recognition between human and divine. Repetition in the epistle serves memory, but it also builds a moral rhythm that disciplines the heart. Phrases echo across paragraphs and sections to reinforce habits of attention and action. Over time, those refrains shape perception, making the faithful more sensitive to injustices and more disposed to mercy. The epistle thus functions as a habit-forming device, ritualized attention that cultivates virtue. At the heart of the letter is a hope for restoration that transcends mere retribution. Enoch imagines a cosmos where broken things are made whole, where the righteous receive not only vindication but also renewed participation in divine life. That restorative imagination connects the epistle to broader themes of healing in religious literature, offering a picture of justice that includes transformation. Restoration, in this view, is the final logic of mercy. The Epistle of the Righteous also dialogues with law and wisdom literature, sharing with Proverbs a concern for practical morality while borrowing prophetic urgency. Where wisdom literature invites prudence and practical skill, Enoch's letter insists on fidelity to an ultimate judge. The combination proves fertile. Wisdom without eschatology can become complacent, while apocalyptic fervor without practical wisdom can become destructive. Enoch integrates both. As a textual phenomenon, the epistle exemplifies how authority accumulates through use. It gains weight when communities incorporate it into worship and when teachers cite it for ethical instruction. Authority, then, is performative. Words become authoritative by being heard, repeated, and embodied. The epistle's authority thus rests not only on alleged authorship by Enoch but on centuries of practical application. Contemplative readers have found in the letter a mirror for interior life. Its descriptions of heavenly books and courts invite inner auditing, a spiritual practice of accounting for one's days. When used meditatively, the epistle encourages a disciplined attention to conscience, to the small daily acts that constitute character. The inner application of the letter turns abstract eschatology into lived psychology. The epistle also participates in the larger narrative about the place of righteous suffering in the world's economy. It reframes suffering as a testing ground, an arena where character is forged and where the righteous are distinguished from the complacent. That reframing does not glorify pain but rather invests it with meaning. For communities facing persecution, such meaning can be a sustained resource for endurance. While some early interpreters read the epistle as deterministic, implying predestined election, many others emphasized human responsibility. The letter's balance leans toward cooperative participation. Grace in the cosmos is real, but so is the need for human decision. This dialectic prevents fatalism while preserving a sense of divine sovereignty, giving moral life both weight and urgency. Iconography inspired by the epistle often shows books, stairways, and radiant courts. Such images serve as constant reminders of the letter's main themes. These visual reminders anchor communities in a shared imagination where justice is both immanent and transcendent. The iconography also helps internalize the epistle's teaching in forms accessible to those who cannot read, thus widening its influence. The survival of the Epistle of the Righteous through centuries suggests that it addresses perennial human concerns: mortality, justice, memory, and meaning. Those topics do not grow obsolete, which explains the letter's persistent relevance. Each era reuses Enoch's words to suit contemporary anxieties, demonstrating the evergreen nature of certain moral truths. The letter's adaptability is therefore not a weakness but a testament to its core insight. In private devotion, the epistle can function like a counselor's voice, urging corrective measures and offering solace. Reading it can feel like consulting a wise elder who understands cosmic stakes. The letter's pastoral sensibility makes it an intimate guide for those grappling with conscience and community. Such personal applications keep the text alive beyond scholarly debates. The epistle's legal metaphors also open conversations about accountability within communities. When leaders appeal to Enoch, they invoke a standard beyond themselves, making a claim to impartial justice. That appeal can be emancipatory, relieving people from the tyranny of local strongmen, but it can also be misused to consolidate power under the guise of divine sanction. The tension reminds us that sacred texts require responsible interpretation. When we read the Epistle of the Righteous today, we are not merely receiving an ancient artifact but entering a conversation that spans millennia. The letter's words find new listeners among those who seek moral clarity in an era of complex institutions and ambiguous loyalties. Enoch's emphasis on memory, names, and cosmic justice offers resources for thinking about identity and responsibility in modern civic life. The conversation continues because the problems it addresses persist. There is a paradox in the epistle's promise that mortality can be countered by the permanence of names and deeds. The letter offers a form of immortality through remembrance and righteousness, an immortality that is ethical rather than biological. That ethical immortality provides a motive for living well, not as a path to fame but as a contribution to a larger moral order. In that sense, Enoch's letter becomes a summons to meaningful living. The rhetorical strategies of the epistle are subtle and varied, combining threat and promise, narrative and imperative, vision and instruction. Enoch uses simile and metaphor but also plain directness to move different kinds of readers. The mixture is strategic. It reaches the fearful with promises and the complacent with warnings, thereby widening its persuasive net. Such rhetorical craft explains why the letter remained compelling for diverse audiences. The epistle's cosmology, where history is juridical and names matter, shapes an ethic of solidarity. If everyone is accountable and remembrance is the prize, then community care becomes a way to secure mutual survival. Acts of mercy and justice are therefore not merely altruistic but mutually sustaining. The epistle thus fosters networks of reciprocal support grounded in deep cosmic imagination. For the scholar and the believer alike, the epistle invites humility about certainty. Its shifting textual history cautions against absolutism, while its moral clarity resists relativism. The reader must negotiate between fidelity to tradition and openness to new contexts. That negotiation is not a flaw but part of the epistle's living vocation, to be a voice that guides rather than a set of frozen laws. One of the most moving aspects of the Epistle of the Righteous is the way it honors human dignity. By promising that names are written in heaven, it affirms that each person matters to the divine economy. Such honor is not granted for social standing but for moral orientation toward justice. In a world where people are often reduced to roles and functions, the epistle insists on personal worth. The letter's final ends are restorative rather than merely punitive. Enoch foresees a recreated world where the righteous dwell securely. This eschatological vision provides a telos that shapes present behavior, turning small acts into steps toward a healed creation. The hope is comprehensive. It aims not only at the vindication of the good but at the transformation of the world into a place where justice is normal. Listening to the Epistle of the Righteous as if it were an eternal letter makes it possible to experience continuity with countless ancestors. The voice that reproves and consoles is the same voice that called communities to patience past the urgencies of empire and war. That continuity is a testament to human longing for meaning beyond fleeting power. The epistle, then, is a link connecting our present anxieties to a broader human saga of hope and endurance. At the psychological level, the epistle offers a framework for dealing with shame and guilt. It emphasizes confession, restitution, and the hope of being remembered. This practical guidance helps people move from paralysis to action, converting remorse into reparative acts. In so doing, it brings psychological insight into conversation with theological commitment. The adaptability of the epistle also allowed it to inform various legal and ethical traditions over time. Its language of covenants and witness influenced how communities structured mutual obligations. That influence is subtle but enduring. Social practices of charity, hospitality, and witness have been fashioned in part by texts like Enoch's letter. The epistle's practical imprints are therefore woven into the fabric of communal life. The figure of Enoch continues to fascinate because he models a life oriented upward. He is the rare example of someone who crosses the ordinary limits and returns with counsel. The epistle thus carries the authority of someone who has seen beyond the veil and who remains engaged with the world. Such bridging figures are precious in any religious tradition because they make the transcendent intelligible. For the modern listener driving down a highway or folding laundry, the epistle's message translates into small choices: whom to remember, how to speak, whether to defend the vulnerable. Those choices, on the surface mundane, are the instruments by which the cosmic ledger is written. The epistle insists that eternity is not only in spectacular visions but in the steady accumulation of ordinary acts. The letter's poetry is spare rather than florid, which gives it a clarity suited to instruction and meditation. Its metaphors are vivid but accessible, making high theology manageable in everyday language. That style supports its function as a text for teaching and formation, since complexity is reduced to memorable images. The balance of beauty and clarity is part of its enduring charm. Finally, the Epistle of the Righteous reminds us that literature can be a form of ethics. A text is not merely information but a training regimen for desires and affections. Reading Enoch is thereby an act of formation. It shapes how we imagine God, neighbor, and self. The letter's power lies in its ability to reconfigure what we love and to reorder our priorities toward mercy and justice. Reading Enoch isn't just learning, it's changing who we are. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if this story made you think more about mercy or about justice.